She didn't know what it was about this particular day, but recently turned 21-year-old Dilia Ketchum knew that today was going to be something very special. She just knew it. She really couldn't explain it, but from the moment she had woken up, everything just seemed to be going right. And not just with her either. When she was watching early morning TV, there were broadcasts on all the channels about very odd Pokémon behavior happening around the world. Apparently, different species of Pokémon had been performing unnaturally kind feats, and not just for each other either, but for people as well. One story was on how a large amount of fighting-type Pokémon surrounded a construction crew that were working on building a new community center in Saffron City. All of the workers, according to news reports, froze when they were surrounded by the fighting types. The next thing that happened surprised them all. The Pokémon began filling onto the job site and started finishing the construction on the new building, completely unbidden. A young worker said, unquote, in an interview, "Those Pokémon went to work on our construction site and started working on that community center we were building. It took us a while to get over the shock, but after we did, we started helping them. And it actually got finished. Good thing too, 'cause we were behind the deadline. All I can say to those Pokémon is thanks." But that was just one circumstance. Pokémon had been reportedly performing amazingly kind and generous deeds for humans all over the world. Another story was about a woman in the Johto region who owned her own greenhouses and flower gardens. She was in the business of growing and selling rare and unique types of flowers and plants that usually only came from other regions. That was at least until a hurricane struck Olivine City and tore through the coastline, which also hit her green farm and thereby destroyed everything. She was distraught and believed her business to be ruined. But, just when everything seemed lost, a large gathering of grass-type Pokémon, who lived in the nearby area, all came to her farm and began using their abilities and moves, such as Sunny Day combined with Synthesis, on her plants and flowers. This had succeeded in giving them new life and healed the marketable vegetation back to their previous vitality. A reporter for Johto Times had caught up with the woman in question and asked for her views on what happened and how she was feeling about it. "I was astounded," the greenhouse owner had animatedly exclaimed. "I thought my business was ruined, but when those Pokémon came and saved my plants, I felt, well, I can't even begin to explain how I felt. I had been hearing the stories on the news about Pokémon around the world doing things completely out of their behavior and helping people, but I never thought that they would do anything like that for me. All I can say to those wonderful Pokémon who helped me is thank you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX Pokemon, who had long histories of fighting with one another, were suddenly getting along perfectly. Like there had never been any feuds between their warring species in the first place. One report that had come in from the Hoenn region, which was witnessed by Professor Birch himself, told how he actually witnessed a Zangoose and Seviper getting along, with not so much as a single fight breaking out between them. Needless to say, after hearing all of these reports, Dilia was shocked. She wouldn't question it though. She was just happy that Arceus had decided to bless humans and Pokémon alike on this rare day of peace and cooperation. After all, today was June 21st and the summer solstice, if she recalled correctly. Maybe that was the cause of all of it. Of course, another reason Dilia might have had to be happy today could have been due to the fact that she was supposed to give birth any day now. Which was a very good thing indeed, because after nearly 9 months of being pregnant, she was anxious to finally see her baby. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX world-famous Professor Oak at his renowned Pokémon research laboratory and ranch. Samuel Oak had always been a good friend to Delia ever since she had known him and was, in some ways, a father figure to her. Her own parents had long since passed when she was younger. So, after getting dressed in a simple pair of blue jean dungarees with a pink t-shirt underneath, Delia tied her hair back into a ponytail, slipped on some comfortable white sneakers, stepped out of her quaint little two-level house and into the morning sun. She was greeted when she entered the outside world by what she was sure was to become a very beautiful day. After walking down the little path from her house and through the gate that separated her yard and the road, she began the trek to Professor Oak's laboratory at a slow and comfortable pace. The lab itself was only up the road a short ways, but in Delia's near 9-month pregnant condition, she was more than happy to take it slow. Plus, it was turning out to be such a beautiful day that she didn't mind the extra time it would take her. Yet again, while walking, the expecting mother was pulled into noticing just how special of a day it seemed to be. The breeze was blowing just enough to usher in the warmth that came with those early summer mornings. And, being that it was June, the weather fit the time perfectly. Dilia marveled at how the trees, flowers and grass seemed to dance with the breeze that was lightly flowing through the area. A flock of pidgey went flying overhead, riding on smooth air currents that seemed like Rayquaza or Tornadus themselves had tamed the wild winds just for that day. A few Rattata even went scurrying into the nearby brush in a field, playing with each other and also enjoying the great day. As she continued to walk, the brunette couldn't help but also think of her husband and the father of her unborn child, Richard Ketchum. Richard was always a go-with-the-flow type of man, very rarely ever taking anything serious. He had a stubbornness in him and such a compulsion for rash, and sometimes stupid, decisions, that he drove her mad. Not to mention the bottomless pit he called a stomach. Dilia swore that after living with Richard for all those years, she could probably have had an award made and given to herself due to all of the food she constantly made for him, which he always seemed to inhale like a vacuum. A little-known secret that very few people knew, except for Richard and Professor Oak, was that she was not always the world-class cook she was now. Oh no indeed. There was a time she couldn't even make ice. But, after marrying Richard, she quickly realized that she would have to learn how to cook and fast. So, with her husband's stomach on the line, she ended up learning how to cook through a home video course. The instructor was a woman named Lisa Stone, who was apparently a world-renowned chef and had worked at some of the most prestigious restaurants in the world. After a few months of learning from her video course, Dilia became a cooking genius. She was able to make practically anything. Not to mention a few dishes she herself invented that, not to brag, but she believed would rival Lisa Stone's own. Of course, Richard praised her newfound culinary skills with vigor. And if not for the fact that he was a very active man, he would probably have gotten fat the first year into their marriage. He even went so far as to give her the nickname, his little Jirachi. At first, Dilia was furious that he would compare her to a Pokémon, no matter whether it was a legendary or not. The only thing that saved Richard from her infamous wooden spoon was when he told her that the only reason he compared her to Jirachi was because, like the wish-granting Pokémon itself, Dilia always seemed to answer all of his hopes, dreams and wishes due to how amazing she was. She smiled at remembering how he would say things like that. Aside from all of his petty little quirks that sometimes drove her crazy, Richard was a good man with a heart of gold that always put others before himself. Especially her. She even recalled when she first met the man. It was at Professor Oak's lab, seemingly an eternity ago. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX Professor Samuel Oak, renowned Pokémon researcher, at his Pokémon laboratory. Upon entering said research facility, Delia's sight was greeted to, instead of the graying-haired professor, a handsome-looking young man standing in the center of the lab. An attractive stranger she had never seen before whom was looking at some of the equipment of the professors. As soon as Delia came in, the man turned around to look at who just arrived. When he did so, she got a good look at him. He was about 5 feet 11, she guessed, not too short and not too tall. He had raven black hair that was cut short, except for at the top of his head, which was longer and spiked up with a single strand of hair coming down over his forehead. He had a chiseled face with 3 scar-like lines on both cheeks. He was wearing a black t-shirt that fit his well-muscled upper body and a maroon-colored full-sleeve leather jacket that had black pockets on both sides of the chest. as well as identical black-colored pockets on the sides of the jacket. On his lower body, he wore tan, almost sandy-colored form-fitting cargo pants that was littered with pockets. He wore a black belt across his waist that had a set of 6 Pokeballs attached to it, leading Dilia to assume that he must have been a Pokémon trainer. He also had a pair of black boots adorning his feet that the bottom of his cargo pants were tucked into. He looked to be in his early 20s and she could feel her face heat up as she took in the man before her. One thought crossed her mind. This guy is so handsome. At the same time, Richard was looking at Dilia and loving everything that he was seeing. From her long brown hair that fell past her shoulders, to her beautiful face that donned the faintest pinkish color of a blush across her cheeks. One in which signified her innocence and the slight embarrassment she felt as she looked at him. She was wearing a short-sleeve white shirt with a purple Pokeball across the chest that was just tight enough to show her impressive bust. Tight blue jeans covered her curvy lower body and on her feet were simple blue sneakers. After getting over his stupor, Richard had one thought go through his own mind. I have been so many places but I have never seen someone so beautiful. Their staring session was broken though when he finally said something. Hi, I'm Richard. He stuck his hand out to shake her hand. Dilia came out of her trance when she noticed that he was addressing her and shook her head to clear it before taking the offered hand and shaking it with her own. Hi. She smiled enthusiastically. I'm Dilia. I was just coming to visit Professor Oak, what about you? After they stopped shaking hands, Richard replied back to her question. I'm actually here for the same reason. I just got back to Kanto today and I was hoping to catch up with Professor Oak and my Pokémon. I think he's out in the corral right now though, finishing up with some research or something. Well, that's Professor Oak, always researching anything to do with Pokémon. I take it you are a Pokémon trainer, right? She asked curiously. The young man seemed surprised. How did you know I was a trainer? She merely giggled. Well, you just admitted you had Pokémon here at the ranch. And I saw the Pokeballs on your belt. Richard suddenly looked sheepish and started rubbing the back of his head with his hand. Yeah, I didn't think about that. Sorry. He laughed. Dilia also laughed and then asked, how do you know the professor anyway? If you don't mind me asking. He pocketed his hands and shrugged. I don't mind at all, Dilia. He smiled brightly at her, which made her blush even more before he continued on. Professor Oak was actually the one who gave me my first Pokémon way back when and he has watched my other Pokémon for me ever since I started my journey. Oh, how long have you been traveling for? Dilia asked. The black-haired trainer formed a happy and proud smile on his face. 10 years, I started when I was 13. She looked impressed. Wow, that's amazing. I bet you and your Pokémon have been on a lot of adventures, huh? Yeah, Richard replied back, still smiling fondly. Me and my pals have been through a lot together. What about you? The young woman just shook her head, still smiling. No, when I was younger I thought about becoming a trainer but it just never happened for personal reasons. I couldn't work up the courage to go on a journey, for one. Pallet Town is such a wonderful place too that I've always been content staying here. There was a time I wanted to seriously leave and see about. Her cheeks turned a little red. Becoming a model but, well, I just love Pallet so much, I never could come to leave it. I work at a grocery store here in town. He smiled back at her. Well, there is certainly nothing wrong with that, Dilia. Pallet Town is a great place to live. In fact, out of all of the places I've been to, I always find myself ready to see this place again at some point. Really? She asked. Absolutely. Richard exclaimed. Every time I come home something happens that makes me glad I did. He smiled shyly while looking at Dilia. Kind of like right now, and I could definitely have seen you as a model by the way. She smiled warmly, blushing again from his compliment, and responded in kind. Well, I'm kind of glad that Professor Oak wasn't around when I got here. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gotten the chance to talk to someone as interesting and sweet as you. Dilia blushed once more as she said that last part, more to herself than anyone else. However, Richard heard and smiled even wider, blushing a little himself. There was a comfortable silence between the two until she asked another question. So, since you've traveled so much and have been to so many places, have you ever won a league tournament? No. Richard shook his head. Me and my Pokémon have never won a league before. We've come close but never actually won yet. Richard looked a little crestfallen for a second but quickly bounced back and said, but we won't ever stop trying. We're going to keep training to get stronger and one day, we will win a league conference. Delia just smiled at Richard's enthusiasm. She was finding this man even more interesting by the second. Not only was he attractive, funny, and had a great personality, but he also was so passionate when it came to his dream and talking about his Pokémon. Richard suddenly looked very nervous and then started fidgeting. You know Delia, he began, looking like he would start sweating any second. Maybe you and I could get together sometime. I could tell you some more about my adventures if you would like. Delia stood shocked. She thought to herself, is he asking me out on a date? Before she could even reply or ponder on what he just said, a loud boom sounded from somewhere out in the fields around the Oak Ranch, shaking the lab. What was that? She shouted. I don't know, Richard replied, already running for the door that lead into the Pokémon ranch out back. But I'm gonna find out. Then I'm coming too, Delia stated passionately while already running after Richard. No, Delia, this could be dangerous. He rebuffed firmly. It could be a rampaging Pokémon for all we know. Richard. She began with hands on her hips. Professor Oak could be in trouble. And if that's the case then I'm coming to help in any way I can. He's like a father to me and I won't just sit here while he could be in danger. The young man looked impressed with her determination and spirit and finally just gave her a small smile before he replied back, okay Delia. Just stay close to me, got it? She nodded stoutly. Yes. Okay then, let's go. Richard shouted as he turned again and took off running once more. With that, the pair took off out of the lab and into the fields of the ranch, looking for the source of the explosion. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX running out into a wide-open section of one of the many fields that encompassed the Oak Ranch and found what was causing the commotion. Two Pokémon, a Tyranitar and a Hydreigon, were in the middle of the field, or the war zone that was once the field, grappling with each other in a duel of strength while roaring at one another. The two Pokémon looked battered and bruised like they had been fighting for quite a while now. The ground had large scorch marks and craters everywhere, large boulders lay smashed into rubble, undoubtedly from the two enraged Pokémon's attacks, and partially buried in some of the nearby rubble was a torn-up-looking Professor Oak. As soon as Dilia caught sight of the elder man, she made to run for him, but Richard held her back. "Hey, what are you doing? Professor Oak needs help," she yelled angrily at him. "And we will, Dilia," Richard soothed. "But first we need to distract those two." He pointed at the two Pokémon currently locked in combat. "How?" asked she in a loss for answers. "I'll break them up and calm them down with my Pokémon," the black-haired man explained. "While I do that, you grab the professor and then get to safety. Understand?" She nodded her head in the affirmative. "Good, then get ready," he ordered. The brave young woman did as told and then looked back at Richard. "Be careful," she urged with a worried look on her face. He merely gave a thumbs up though and smiled. "You got it." She returned the smile and then got ready while Richard took off and got nearer to the two battling Pokémon. He quickly pulled two Pokéballs from his belt and threw them into the air. "Blastoise, Flygon, I choose you." The two fully evolved Pokémon appeared with shouts of their names and announced their readiness to battle. "Blast, Fly. Okay guys," Richard hurriedly addressed his Pokémon. "We have to stop those two from fighting." He then pointed at the fighting Tyranitar and Hydreigon. "You ready?" His Pokémon nodded their heads resolutely, ready for battle. "Okay, let's start this off." The dark-eyed man raised his hand. "Blastoise, Hydro Pump. Flygon, Dragon Breath. Bloss. Toys." Blastoise shouted as he launched a powerful water attack from the two cannons on his back. "Fly." Flygon yelled as he unleashed a powerful, clear beam of energy from his mouth that looked like a circular funnel of devastating wind. Both attacks hit their marks though and immediately sent the two enraged Pokémon crashing back into some of the nearby trees. Richard didn't celebrate however. He knew it wasn't over and he was right. Both pseudo-legendary Pokémon came bursting out from the tree line, completely forgetting their feud for now and instead opting to find who dared to attack them and interrupt their battle. Once they set their eyes on Blastoise and Flygon, who were waiting for them in the center of the field, they bellowed in rage and started to charge. "Guys, be careful and get ready to dodge," the experienced and seasoned trainer warned. His Pokémon merely nodded their heads, showing that they understood. Tyranitar roared and threw its arms out to the side as a light, purplish shroud of energy exploded forth around its large, armored body. Then, with yellow streaks of light, like electricity, arcing around it, the rage-fueled Pokémon took off like a shot and quickly closed the gap between it and Blastoise. Richard recognized the signs of Giga Impact when he saw it and quickly yelled, "Blastoise! Fight power with power! Use Aqua Jet!" Just as Tyranitar came charging across the field cloaked in the powerful invisible energy, Blastoise lowered himself down and grunted as he became suffused in a dome of water that came from the cannons on his back. One encased in raw energy and the other, a shell of swirling water, both of them converged on the other before colliding with a loud smashing sound and two loud war cries. When the two opposing forces met, they not only clashed but immediately started to battle for supremacy. Blastoise, from inside of the watery shell of Aqua Jet, fought against Tyranitar as the larger Pokémon growled and tried to overwhelm him with the sheer power of Giga Impact. Knowing his Pokémon would be overcome if he didn't do something, Richard had an idea suddenly come to him and then grinned. "Yeah, let's try that." He then yelled loud enough to be heard. "Blastoise, use Hydro Pump in conjunction with Aqua Jet. Shoot it at Tyranitar." Narrowing his eyes, Blastoise bellowed deeply just before both cannons on his back erupted. From them went twin vortexes of water that took Tyranitar by surprise and slammed straight into its armor-plated torso. This effectively ended the battle of wills between the two of them since the powerful cannon shots of water also had the added benefit of being extremely effective against a partial rock type like Tyranitar. Getting pushed back for quite some distance by the force of Hydro Pump, its feet leaving deep ruts in the earth as an effect, Tyranitar roared and vocalized its pain. Unfortunately, Blastoise compounded onto that pain as the fully evolved Pokémon surged forward in his aquatic shell again. No longer hindered, he put as much speed and power behind the attack as he could and then slammed himself into Tyranitar's chest. The brutal double assault combo sent the larger and stronger Pokémon flying off of its feet and through the air for quite some distance. Then, with a thudding sound that was combined with the noise of ground shattering, Tyranitar landed and made a small crater where his large mass came to rest. Blastoise, ending the attack, also landed on the firm but battle-torn ground and watched Tyranitar with an intense glare and a stout expression. Almost as if waiting expectantly for it to stand back up. Richard couldn't savor the moment though since he quickly had to turn his attention to his other Pokémon. When he did, he saw Hydreigon ascending into the air while a vortex of shining white, almost blue energy began shrouding it. Before long, the energy forming around the tri-headed dragon type started to take on the appearance of an actual dragon itself. Then, now encased in the ethereal energy that was around it, Hydreigon screeched and bolted down toward Flygon using what could only have been Dragon Rush. Taking decisive action, he commanded, "Flygon, wait until it's almost on you and then use agility to get out of the way." Just as Hydreigon was about to smash into the other Pokémon, Flygon tensed and then shot into the air like a green blur, making great use of his already impressive speed combined with agility to do so. Because of this, Hydreigon missed its mark and passed right under Flygon, the powerful draconian attack smashing into the ground and exploding like a meteorite instead. Smirking, the black-haired man cheered. "Good Flygon. Now, while Hydreigon is recovering, get in close and use Dragon Claw. Then, follow it up with Dragon Tail." Obeying without question, the rare Hoenn Pokémon flew down in yet another blur of speed and got right in front of Hydreigon as the triple-headed dragon recovered its senses from inside of the small crater it was now standing in. With his 3 front claws now extended and glowing white, Flygon quickly slashed them down across all 3 of the rampaging Pokémon's faces, causing it to bellow in pain and stumble back. Not keen on losing the chance presented, Flygon immediately spun around in a full circle while his long tail started to glow in a manner similar to his claws earlier. While Hydreigon was still reeling back from the previous, very effective attack, the incoming tail strike wasn't seen until it was too late. The result of this was that the angered dragon type got clobbered right in the center of its body and went soaring out of the crater and across the field. The force of the damaging strike was great enough that it sent Hydreigon smashing into Tyranitar, whom was just starting to stand back up. Blastoise and Flygon stood together now, close to one another, while Richard looked to where the 2 other enraged Pokémon were getting back up slowly. The painful and damaging attacks both of them had suffered now had them growling in venomous rage and preparing to charge again. He spared a moment to look back to where Dilia was at and was pleased to see that, while his Pokémon were battling their rogue cousins, Dilia had retrieved Professor Oak and was currently tending to his wounds. He didn't seem to be too badly hurt, only a little beat up. Hopefully, that meant he would be okay. Yet again though, Richard was surprised by Dilia. She was brave enough to run onto the field of a raging battle to save a friend that had been in trouble. It was safe to say that he was definitely taken with the young beauty. She was evidently a courageous and strong woman, and he would have been lying had he said that it didn't attract him. Unfortunately, he didn't have any more time to think because he suddenly heard 2 loud roars of rage coming from behind him. When he turned around, he saw both Tyranitar and Hydreigon standing up again and looking outright furious. Richard, slipping back into battle mode, warned his 2 Pokémon to be careful and they merely nodded their heads, still ready to go. At that moment however, something strange happened. Both rivaling Pokémon shared a look between the 2 of them and then nodded to one another before they both took off charging at Richard's Pokémon. "Get ready guys, here they come," he urgently warned, and Blastoise and Flygon got into position. "Alright, Blastoise, use Ice Beam. Flygon, give them a Sonic Boom." The 2 partner Pokémon quickly launched their attacks at the charging pseudo-legendaries. Blastoise utilized a move Richard had specially taught him by firing a freezing beam of ice from his mouth. Simultaneously, Flygon's wings vibrated at speed so fast that it caused powerful sound waves to emit from the rapidly fluttering appendages. However, just as the attacks were about to hit their targets, something happened that Richard did not expect. Tyranitar turned towards the icy beam heading for Hydreigon and managed to stop it by countering with Dark Pulse. A powerful dark-type attack that sent multiple rings of pulsating, nefariously black energy on a collision course with the beam of ice and succeeded in cancelling it out. At the same time, Hydreigon also turned to face the sonic blades of wind heading for Tyranitar and used the powerful energy blast of a fast dragon pulse attack to destroy them. Keeping their momentum going after stopping the attacks that had been heading for them, the 2 temporary allies closed in on Richard's Pokémon. Before he could utter a single command, Tyranitar got right in front of Blastoise and began using the brutal, savage and wild attack of Thrash on the large water Pokémon. At the same time, Hydreigon closed with Flygon and used the dreadfully effective combo attack of Dragon Rush to smash into him, followed by another Dragon Pulse that struck Flygon dead center and sent him soaring back towards Blastoise. This occurred just as Tyranitar finished ruthlessly beating on the fully evolved form of Squirtle and then shoved the now stunned turtle right into Flygon's line of trajectory. Of course, in their current damaged and pained conditions, they did indeed crash into one another and went down to the ground. Holding itself up tall and imposingly, Tyranitar's fury-filled eyes showed a dangerous gleam as it opened its mouth and started to charge up a brightly shining ball of yellow energy. Due to the signature glow and circular shape of the orangish, yellow sphere, it was quite clearly a forming hyper beam. Beside of the dual rock dark type, Hydreigon's main head also began summoning the dark blue energy that was needed to use yet another dragon type attack. And by the glow that was starting in its belly and working up to its throat, it was most likely going to be Dragon Rage. Knowing exactly what those attacks were, Richard called out for his downed Pokémon to stand up and get out of the way. Unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be because at that very second, both of the rampaging titans fired their respective beams of awesome power right at Blastoise and Flygon. There was nothing Richard could do but watch in horror as the twin energy attacks hit his Pokémon, causing a large explosion and kicking up a huge smoke cloud in the process. He, Dilia and the now conscious Professor Oak watched anxiously as the dust cloud cleared to show the results of the powerful combined attack. What they saw, however, shocked them all. Even Richard. Blastoise was seen laying over top of Flygon while retracted into his shell. There were bad scorch marks atop the defensive, reptilian surface from where the dual attack struck. Fortunately though, aside from that, both Blastoise and Flygon were fine and soon stood back up. Richard was both dumbfounded that his Pokémon were able to do such a thing in so short an amount of time, yet also proud he had raised them well enough that they would instinctively protect one another. Even without a command from their trainer. The short black-haired man smiled at the positive turn of events in the battle and felt himself become completely re-energized. One look at his Pokémon and he could tell they felt the same way. That could not be said, however, for their opponents. Both Tyranitar and Hydreigon looked exhausted from the battle with each other and then against Richard's Pokémon afterwards. Not to mention, the powerful energy beams they both used in an attempt to defeat their opponents had also drained their stamina greatly. Even still, their anger and pride would not allow them to give up, and with another bellow of rage, they began to charge. "Okay my friends," Richard smiled confidently. "Are you ready to end this?" Both Blastoise and Flygon called up to the sky, signaling that they were ready to go. "Okay then." He raised and clenched his fist. "Let's stop that charge before they can gain any momentum. Flygon, use Earthquake to knock them off balance. Blastoise, I want you to use a flash cannon burst to blind them." Flygon raised up onto both legs and then extended his wings before flying straight up into the air. However, he didn't go far before the winged, part dragon type dropped himself back towards the ground with a loud screech that filled the air. As soon as he made impact with the grassy field below, all of Flygon's weight landed like the drop of an immensely heavy slab of steel. This instantly caused the ground, in a wide radius of the area, to start shaking and violently trembling. The force of the sporadic earthquake had a great enough magnitude that even the heavy and sturdy Tyranitar had to stop its ballistic charge and balance itself just to keep from tumbling over. Hydreigon normally wouldn't have been affected since it was a flying Pokémon, but Blastoise, acting on his own, fired a single shot of Hydro Pump at the three-headed dragon and caught it by surprise. The blast of water hit its mark and Hydreigon fell to the ground next to Tyranitar. This, by extension, caused it to become trapped by the wild shaking of Flygon's earthquake. Therefore, both it and Tyranitar began struggling just to stand up. At the same time, Blastoise, whom had dropped down to all fours in order to keep from being affected by the quake, aimed both cannons at he and his battling partner's now unsteady opponents. Then, with a low chant, the third stage evolved Pokémon charged up and quickly fired two shining beams of bright silver energy out of the cannons on his back. These same twin bursts of shining light flew across the short distance, separating them from their targets in no time at all. However, instead of the steel-type move hitting one or both of the other Pokémon, both large beams of energy struck the ground right in front of them. This occurred just as the effects of earthquake began fading. Due to the blasts of silver energy hitting the ground instead of Tyranitar and Hydreigon, it caused a powerful and blinding flash of light to explode and fill the area instead. The benefit of such a tactic was soon shown when both of the formerly bickering Pokémon were now stumbling around like two blind Zubat. It was then that Richard's plan was revealed to Dilia and Professor Oak, whom were watching the battle with rapt attention. Earthquake and Flash Cannon had only been mere diversions and nothing more. The former had been meant to break their route and cause the two angry Pokémon to get off balance. The latter attack was likewise intended to blind and further disorient the two of them. Seeing their moment at hand, Richard nodded in satisfaction and then hurried to build onto the ground they had gained. Both of you, let's turn up the heat now. Blastoise, use Skull Bash and Flygon, use Dragon Rush. With both of their opponents still too distracted and now effectively blinded to defend themselves, Richard's Pokémon quickly utilized their attacks. Blastoise lowered himself down and then took off at a blistering fast charge towards Tyranitar. As he did, the giant turtle's body started to become shrouded in a white glow just before his feet left the ground and he appeared to turn into a shelled torpedo. At the same time, Flygon became suffused in the unique draconian energy that preluded any dragon-type move. Soon, therefore, he too was charging right alongside Blastoise with his target being Hydreigon. In the span of only a few seconds, the two trained Pokémon collided with their intended targets. Blastoise smashed himself and all of his mass straight into Tyranitar's armored torso while Flygon rammed his own speeding body into Hydreigon. The attacks worked like a charm and since neither of them were coherent enough to brace themselves, the pseudo-legendaries were sent sailing back across the field with roars of surprise and pain. Especially Hydreigon since Flygon's last attack had been extremely effective. As they landed on the ground next to each other with loud thuds, Richard gave another round of commands to his Pokémon. Blastoise use Hydro Pump and Flygon, Dragon Rage. While their opponents struggled to regain their senses after being dealt the former two damaging blows, Blastoise and Flygon moved swiftly in action. The former sent two powerful cannons of water at Tyranitar and likewise, Flygon did the same at Hydreigon after building up and releasing the signature Dragon-type attack. This time, the other two Pokémon saw it coming but there wasn't enough time to act. Before they could get up and move, both attacks hit at the same time and struck their targets with pinpoint accuracy. Releasing two identical bellows of pain, Tyranitar and Hydreigon were once more blasted back across the field for quite some distance, only this time they went tumbling instead of flying. For the former, the twin cannons of water had dealt crippling damage and for the latter, the same could be said when Dragon Rage had struck Hydreigon. When the two ill-mannered Pokémon hit the ground again, Richard knew that the time for victory was at hand. Thus, like the experienced trainer he was, he went into action without wasting a single second. Let's this wrap up. Blastoise, I want you to use Hydro Cannon and Flygon, give Hydreigon your Hyper Beam. Blastoise's eyes seemed to glow with power, like a hot blue flame, for just a second before he raised up to his full height and gave his voice to the air in a loud yell. Blah-ost. At the same time, Flygon flew into the air a short ways and opened his mouth as a spiraling sphere of orange energy started to form inside of it. Then, after only a few short moments passed, Richard's Pokémon unleashed their attacks with a final roaring shout of their names. Fly! Blah-ostoise! From the cannons on Blastoise's back came two huge jets that came together as they traveled through the air and formed one mighty torrent of water. Likewise, from Flygon's mouth came a condensed, powerfully destructive beam of raw energy that raced in line beside of Blastoise's own attack. Both of them were on a dead-ahead collision course and nothing could stop it. Tyranitar and Hydreigon were hopeless to save themselves and when both supremely powerful attacks finally hit their marks, a powerful explosion rocked the entire field for quite some distance and nearly knocked the humans onto their stomachs. A cloud of black smoke and dust was tossed into the air like a mushroom cloud. It was so large in fact that many of the inhabitants of Pallet Town were able to see the strange cloud hanging in the sky over the Oak Ranch. Richard, Dilia and Professor Oak had been forced to cover their faces from the windstorm that had been kicked up in the aftermath of the dual attacks. All they could do for a short time after that was to stare into the cloud of smoke through slitted eyes and try to see the results of the brutal final assault. When the thick cloud finally did dissipate and visibility was restored, they all saw a large crater now existing, though shallow, where Tyranitar and Hydreigon had been standing moments before. Now, both of the out-of-control Pokémon were laying, one atop the other, in an unconscious heap within the center of the crater. Seeing that they were victorious, Richard let out a yell of triumph and ran over to his now exhausted Pokémon so that he could congratulate them, soon hugging and thanking both Blastoise and Flygon profusely. Professor Oak and Delia smiled at the scene and went to join the celebrating trio. After Richard returned his trusted partners, he turned around just in time to see Dilia running at him and then flinging her arms around him in a tight hug. Once they separated from one another, Dilia just looked at him appraising Ly and excitedly proclaimed, "That was one of the most amazing things I have ever seen. You and your Pokémon were so brave and strong in that battle. I have never seen a trainer and his Pokémon so in sync with each other before." The black-haired man looked embarrassed and replied while rubbing the back of his neck, "You were also really impressive, Dilia. I don't know many people who would actually run out onto the middle of a battlefield just to save a friend. That was really brave of you." She blushed under his praise and then, with no real reason why, she kissed his cheek. Richard blushed tomato berry red as she did and then smiled in that goofy way of his. Professor Oak, who had been silently observing the little exchange with a small and knowing grin, decided to make himself known for the first time. "I have to agree with Richard, Dilia. Saving an old man like me was a very brave thing to do." The young couple parted quickly from their close distance to one another, having forgotten that the professor was there and now blushing up a storm as they stepped apart. "Professor," she asked in concern after reining in her embarrassment, "how are you feeling?" "Oh, I'm fine, Dilia, my dear. Just a few scrapes and bruises is all. Nothing that won't heal with time," the kindly older man answered with a smile. "Of course, if it wouldn't have been for you and Richard here, it could have been much, much worse. Not just for me either but for all of the Pokémon here at the lab as well." Richard took that time to enter the conversation. "Professor Oak," he began. "What caused those two Pokémon to go crazy like that?" He gestured to the unconscious Tyranitar and Hydreigon. Professor Oak just sighed sadly and walked up to the two Pokémon that had taken quite a beating in the battle. Kneeling down, he drew two Pokéballs from his lab coat and returned the defeated Pokémon. Standing back up, he turned to Richard again and said solemnly, "Trainer negligence is what happened, my boy. Trainer negligence." Richard and Dilia both appeared confused and asked at the same time, "What do you mean, Professor?" The seasoned expert just chuckled at the two of them answering in tandem, which caused them to blush again, before he replied to their question. "You see, there is a particular trainer that I sponsor who has, for lack of a better word, an obsession with obtaining powerful Pokémon like Tyranitar and Hydreigon. But of course, as we all know, it takes a very skilled and talented trainer to be able to handle raising pseudo-legendary Pokémon, such as those two, or they might end up disobeying and becoming unruly. They could even abandon their trainer." "Yeah, I know all about that." Richard spoke quietly. Dilia looked quizzically at him after he said that while Professor Oak became quiet and got a sad and pitying look on his face. "What do you mean?" she asked the handsome young man. He looked down with sorrow in his eyes. "I used to have a Dragonite before. I caught it as a Dratini and it always listened to me fine as both a Dratini and a Dragonair. But, when it evolved into a Dragonite, it just wouldn't obey me anymore. I didn't know why either. I was an experienced trainer and had fought and defeated many strong opponents before but for some reason, Dragonite just wouldn't listen to me. So, one day," he swallowed thickly, "I released it." Dilia appeared shocked. "Why, Richard?" He looked up sadly and gave a morose smile. "It was what it wanted. Dragonite wasn't a bad Pokémon, just the opposite actually, but when a Pokémon like a pseudo-legendary is either caught in its final form or is evolved to that point by a trainer, it needs to feel like that person is strong and worthy enough to be able to call them their trainer. Apparently, Dragonite knew I was not that person so I released him." Dilia was still stunned. A Pokémon not obeying Richard simply didn't seem possible. She just couldn't believe it after seeing the way he and his Pokémon had just battled together. She was even more surprised that Richard actually gave up his Dragonite willingly and just let it go. Then again, she could understand why. He had just wanted his Pokémon to be happy and if he couldn't do that then he wanted Dragonite to able to get it from somewhere. Even if it was with another trainer. Dilia felt herself grow even stronger feelings of respect for Richard with that sudden realization of how selfless he was. With all that in mind, she smiled at him. "I'm sure that Dragonite is very happy wherever he is now. You did the right thing, something very few people could do." Feel proud of that. He smiled back at her softly. Thank you, Delia, that means a lot coming from you. Really, it does. I think about Dragonite all the time and I can only hope that wherever he is, he's happy. Professor Oak finally rejoined the conversation at that point. And Richard's situation with Dragonite is pretty much the same problem that we had here today. When the two of them turned to face the aged Pokémon professor again, he finished his explanation from earlier. As I was saying before, this Tyranitar and Hydreigon do not respect their trainer and so they never do anything he asks of them. I imagine he became tired of dealing with them so he sent them to me for a while. However, he never told me that those two cannot stand one another and that any time they are out of their Pokéballs, they fight. When I tried to stop it, well, you saw the results of that. So, what will happen to these two Pokémon now, Professor? Delia asked. Most likely, I will have to isolate them in completely different areas of the preserve I own here at the ranch so they never see each other. Otherwise, we could have a repeat of today. The young brunette looked sad and also upset at the fact that those two Pokémon would have to suffer in isolation because of an irresponsible trainer. Richard was just frustrated at the trainer in question and their carelessness in general. It is a shame, the professor agreed, but I'm sure everything will work out. Now if you two will please excuse me. He held up the Pokéballs that he had in his hands. I have new accommodations that I need to think up for these two and I believe they could also do with a nice long rest under the Pokémon Recovery Machine, or PRM for short. So, I will see the two of you at a later date. And thank you again for your help by the way, both of you. You truly make a great team. Delia and Richard both went red yet again at that comment, but before either could say anything, he continued on. You know, I believe a nice new restaurant just opened up in town. Why don't you two go check it out this evening? I hear it's very nice. The sneaky professor winked at the young pair and then walked back up towards the lab before either of them could say anything. The young man and woman stood in silence for a few moments before Richard finally spoke. You know, that offer for us to get together and discuss my travels still stands. If you would want to, that is. Delia, for a moment, was speechless before a big smile came across her face. I would love to. Now it was his turn to be shocked for a moment before he cracked a huge, goofy grin. Great. How about we go now? I just need to stop by the lab for a minute so I can drop off my Pokémon and get Blastoise and Flygon healed up. Sounds good to me, she agreed excitedly. After that, the pair walked up to the lab, chatting non-stop about everything and if you looked just closely enough, with their hands almost touching. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX Very soon after meeting, Dilia and Richard became romantically involved. He was supposed to head back out on another journey, but his relationship with Dilia ended up just being more important to him. So, he hung up his Pokeball belt and stayed. After some time, they married and bought the house that Delia lived in now, which was situated comfortably in the tiny little valley of Pallet Town. It was only 10 minutes to Professor Oak's lab and about the same time distance that separated the rural housing and farming area of Pallet from the small town itself. Delia and Richard loved each other fiercely and lived happily together for the better part of 2 years. Over time, however, Richard began to miss traveling around the world with his Pokémon, and Delia could see that. She loved her husband deeply, and the last thing she wanted was to see him unhappy. So, the compassionate young woman told Richard one day that she wanted him to go on another journey with his Pokémon so that he could do what made him truly happy. As much as she knew he loved her, being caged in one place, even a place as wonderful as Pallet Town, was just not meant for Richard. He had a wild spirit and she didn't want to break that in him. Richard was, at first, reluctant, and denied the offer. He told her that he truly was happy being married to her and that he loved her very much. Delia told him in turn that she knew he was happy being her husband and that she especially knew how much he loved her. However, she also pointed out that being tied down was something that didn't make him happy, and she asked him to honestly admit that to himself and to her. After thinking on it for a long time, he admitted that she was right and that he did miss traveling the world with his Pokémon. At first, he had asked Dilia to go with him, but they both knew she couldn't. She loved Pallet Town and couldn't leave it behind. So, in the end, Richard decided to begin traveling with his Pokémon again. He and Dilia agreed that, since they loved each other so much, they would still remain married. Richard knew that he wouldn't be traveling forever after all. Eventually, he and his Pokémon were going to get tired of the constant wandering, and when that day came, Dilia said that she would welcome Richard back home with open arms and that then, they would spend the rest of their lives together. After all, they were both still very young. With her being just 21 and him being only 24, they had plenty of time to achieve their goals in life. And right now, Richard's dream was to become the winner of at least one league conference. And Delia's own dream was to support him on his journey and wait for the day that they could be together permanently. So, on very good and loving terms, Dilia and Richard parted ways for the first time in 2 years, not knowing when they would see each other again. However, not before sharing one last night together. That night was now just about 9 months ago, and it would seem that Richard had left Dilia with a special parting gift that only he could give her. She hoped deeply that, at some point in the not-so-distant future, Richard would be able to see their child. After all, he hadn't even known that she was pregnant before he left. Had that have been the case, Dilia knew he would have forsaken the traveling life forever to stay at home with his family. All she could do was hope. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX made it to the red stone gateway that lead to the stairs, which then went all the way up the hill to the lab's front door. Thus, pushing the metal gates open, she started slowly walking up the well-laned stone steps, which were lined on either side by neatly trimmed bushes. As soon as she made it to the top of the stairs, a little out of breath due to her current pregnant condition, she knocked on the door and let herself in. Doing so, she recalled the words Professor Oak had once said when he told her that she needn't knock whenever she came visiting. Upon entering the lab, she was greeted by the usual sight of Pokémon research machinery and equipment everywhere. After calling for the professor and not getting an answer, she opted to go check the one place she always found him when he wasn't working with his research equipment or out studying the Pokémon in the ranch fields. Knowing where to go, she made her way to the second floor, which was accessed by taking one of two staircases found on either side of the main, ground-level room that went up onto an elevated loft. At the top there was the usual collection of machines, tables, bookshelves and papers which were spread out over said tables. Taking the left side staircase, Dilia went up onto the platform and then turned toward a green door that was to her left. Walking over and opening the door, she found herself staring at yet another flight of steps awaiting her. Preparing herself for another upward trek, she took the steps one at a time until she eventually reached the top. When she came to the top of the steps themselves, which were girded at the left side with a metal railing, she looked into the large second-floor room and then glanced around. This room was much like the one below. It had equipment large and small taking up almost every square inch of free space. As well as yet more shelves, filing cabinets, tables and other items that were crucial to a researcher's job of any profession. And there, in the center of the room, resided the circular machine that the professor would keep the Pokeballs that contained all 3 Kanto starters for brand new trainers. There were none being kept there now of course since Professor Oak only handed out starter Pokémon whenever the league provided him with new Squirtle, Bulbasaur and Charmander. And that typically only came about once every 2 or 3 months. Turning her gaze farther to the left, she finally caught sight of the aged but still spry professor as he sat at his desk in front of a large computer monitor that was mounted onto the wall. Moreover, she could see that he was currently having an apparently serious conversation with someone undoubtedly important on the large monitor's screen. Not wanting to disturb him, Dilia went over and sat on a couch that was near the staircase. There, she rested her back and sore feet while waiting for Professor Oak to finish his conversation. The young mother-to-be knew that being one of the most renowned Pokémon researchers in the world meant that he was always getting calls asking for his help, assistance or opinion on something, of some kind, to do with Pokémon and anything related to them. When he was finally done with his conversation, Professor Oak stood up from his chair and upon turning around and seeing Delia, he offered her a smile. "Ah, Delia. What a pleasant surprise, good to see you. How are things and how are you faring in your condition?" She smiled back and replied while rubbing her stomach. "I'm doing very well today, thank you. Though I am ready to have this baby." "Yes, I am sure you are, my dear," he chuckled back. "So, who were you talking with, Professor?" she asked curiously. "If I am allowed to ask, of course." The older man sat down beside Delia and crossed his arms before replying. "That was my old friend Professor Rowan, the Sinnoh region's leading authority on Pokémon. He had called to tell me about one of his sponsored trainers who just recently became the Sinnoh League champion. Apparently, she is the talk of the whole region right now, being the youngest person to ever become a league champion at just 16. The way Rowan makes it sound, that young girl and her Garchomp are practically unbeatable." Delia was very impressed with the young woman's supposed great skill at Pokémon training and commented on it. "That is a very impressive accomplishment indeed. To think, one so young already at the top." She also couldn't help but think of Richard at that moment and hoped he was okay. "Yes, that it is, my dear, that it is." Professor Oak could tell Delia was thinking of Richard and he let her have her moment before continuing. "We were also discussing the strange behavior of all the Pokémon that has been occurring in so many regions lately." "Yes, I have been wondering about that myself," Delia commented as she came out of her musings. "Do you or any of the other professors have any idea what's causing it?" Professor Oak just shook his head in the negative. "I'm afraid we do not actually. This is completely out of the ordinary for Pokémon behavior. While it is not unheard of for certain species of Pokémon to go out of character at certain times and during certain events, like in breeding or with migratory patterns." He scratched his chin for a moment in thought before finishing his explanation. "It is simply unheard of for all of the world's Pokémon to start helping humans and each other randomly like this for no reason. It is, with no other explanation, a mystery, plain and simple." He then looked at the young woman closely for a time. "Although," the astute older man added as an afterthought, "the whole time you have been pregnant, Delia, Pokémon have been doing strange and bizarre things around you." She looked at him, puzzled. "What do you mean, Professor?" He frowned slightly and lifted a finger. "I'm sure you remember what happened to you when you came to the lab a few weeks ago. When you were almost injured helping me with the Pokémon out on the ranch." Delia shivered a little when she thought of the memory in question but recalled it nonetheless. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX was outside in the lush, vast fields of the Oak Ranch. She was helping to feed some of the Pokémon for the professor while he was looking into a few very important research papers that he had just received from the Kalos region on Mega Evolution. Research files in fact that came from Professor Sycamore, leading authority on such matters in Kalos. She had been assisting Professor Oak at the lab with all the Pokémon ever since Richard left and had continued to do so even after she found that she was pregnant. Over the past few months, however, her ability to do much at all had drastically decreased. She was now pretty much limited to feeding, grooming, or watching over the Pokémon per direct orders from Professor Oak. Ever since Dilia had become pregnant and Richard was not there to help her, the professor had stepped in and played the helping hand for her. He was always there letting her know what she could and couldn't do, and he just generally looked out for she and her unborn child's safety. Much like a father would do really. Dilia and Professor Oak had always possessed a kind of surrogate father-daughter relationship since he had known her ever since she was a little girl. After she grew a little older and then especially after her parents died when she was around 10, Professor Oak had just sort of taken her under his wing. Even though she lived with her aunt after her parents passed on, the kindly and grandfatherly Samuel Oak played just as much a part in helping her grow up right, with good morals, as her aunt did. After all, it had been very difficult losing her parents, Adam and Emma, at such a young, tender age, and she fully credited her Aunt Ruby and Professor Oak for helping her get through that tragedy, as well as keeping her from turning into a rebellious teen during those tense years of her early life. She had even more to be grateful to Oak for when, at 16, her Aunt Ruby also passed away from a sudden massive heart attack. Even though she had been old enough to technically take care of herself when her aunt died, it had been hard. Very hard. She worked at a local grocery store in the actual town of Pallet itself to earn enough money to afford all the essentials she needed to live on. She was also able to afford, through sound financial management that the professor helped her with greatly, to stay in the townhouse in Pallet that she and Ruby had lived in together. It was during those hard 3 years before meeting Richard that she had been in the need of Professor Oak's company the most. Not so much in the way of helping to take care of her, since she had been quite self-sufficient, but more along the lines of being a friend. A warm human presence that gave her the companionship she so desperately needed after all she had been through. Though she never pursued the modeling gig that she had once harbored passing thoughts about getting into, the professor had taken over for her Aunt Ruby in supporting her in anything she wanted to do. Naturally, she had felt extremely thankful for that support, but, due to everything she had on her plate when her aunt died and also due to her own shyness and refusal to leave Pallet, the modeling career simply never materialized. Strangely, even Richard had started to try and urge her into trying it shortly after they got married. Of course she never did still. In short, Dilia knew that, in a way, Professor Oak looked at the child growing within her belly as his surrogate grandchild and just wanted to make sure that she and her child would both be safe and well looked after. Not to mention the fact that Richard was always Professor Oak's favorite trainer that he sponsored, and so taking care of her was something that the professor could do for him as well. Professor Oak had a daughter, a 7-year-old granddaughter, as well as a 1-week-old grandson of his own, but that still didn't stop him from caring for Dilia the same as he did his own family. That was just the kind of person he was, always caring and looking out for those precious to him. Dilia knew Professor Oak's family well also and was actually good friends with his daughter, Amelia. They had known each other for a long time, ever since Delia's parents had moved them to Pallet Town when she was 5, and had always gotten along great. Even from the first time they met when Professor Oak's family had come to her parents' now demolished house to greet them to the neighborhood. Amelia was 3 years older than she and sort of played the role of an older sister to her. She too, like the professor her father, had been a major lifeline for Dilia after she lost her parents and aunt, so closely together at that. Even though they had both been pregnant at the same time, Amelia was still the more experienced of the two since she had gotten pregnant once before, at the relatively young age of 17, and therefore already had her 7-year-old daughter, Daisy. Needless to say, Dilia felt as though she never would have been able to make it the last 9 months had it not been for Amelia helping her through all of the pregnancy issues while also enduring her own. In fact, the older woman had given birth to her son Gary a week ago, so Dilia felt sure that she should follow suit soon. At least, hopefully. The expectant mother could currently be seen finishing up feeding a group of ponyta in one of the fields that was close to the lab. She was just emptying her food pail and was getting ready to head back up to the laboratory when she heard what sounded like a call of distress, mingled in amongst the sounds of a battle being waged. Dilia, being the caring and curious person she was, took off as fast as her pregnant body could safely carry her. After passing through a few of the other fields that were full of Pokémon, she finally stopped in a large, grassy plain where many of the bigger ones congregated. In front of her, about 10 yards away, was the sight of a large Beardic hovering over the downed and beaten-up form of a mother Ursaring shielding her young cub. The Beardic had its claws extended in a clear sign of the impending slash attack that it was getting ready to harm the mother and child with. Dilia didn't know what to do. Richard wasn't there to resolve this situation with his Pokémon like last time, and she didn't have a Pokémon to so much as even think about fighting the angry Beardic off with. She was torn. On one hand, she wanted to help the mother Ursaring who was risking her life to shield her young right now, much like Dilia herself would do if her own child's life was at risk. Though on the other hand, she didn't want to risk the life of her baby by getting in the way of a large and dangerous Pokémon that was ready to attack. In the end, she knew that she just couldn't risk it, so instead, she decided that she would run back to the lab as fast as possible and get Professor Oak. He would obviously know what to do. Though, just as she was about to take off running, something stopped her. Dilia felt as though her feet were rooted to the earth and she couldn't move a single muscle. She suddenly felt a strong compulsion to just run in and stand in front of the enraged Beardic and stop its attack however necessary. She didn't know what made her think such crazy thoughts. She knew that if she stood in the way of that slash attack, she could be seriously injured and, very possibly, harm her child as well. The now scared young woman tried to break the invisible hold on her body, but no matter what she did, she couldn't free herself from whatever force was holding her in place. The compulsion just seemed to get stronger and Dilia kept feeling a strange sensation coming from within her stomach, where her baby lay safely protected inside of her. Before she knew what she was doing, she found herself running towards the downed Ursaring and the attacking Beardic. She tried to stop and turn herself around and run the other way, but she simply could not. The next thing Dilia knew, she was throwing herself in between the Beardic and its intended target with her arms spread out to the sides. Looking up at the towering form of the enraged ice-type Pokémon, she was frozen again in place. The attacking Ursine just growled at the obstacle standing in the way of its quarry and reared its arm back, claws extended and glowing bright white signaling the incoming slash attack. Dilia closed her eyes, preparing for the unavoidable direct attack that she was about to receive. A single tear rolled down her eye as she silently apologized to her unborn child for this act of extreme foolishness that was about to end its life and very possibly, her own as well. Not that such a thing mattered to her at present, as she thought regretfully to herself. "I'm so sorry, my dear sweet angel, for doing this and ending your life before it even began. I just cannot control my own body for some reason. And Richard, my love, please forgive me for what I have done, to myself and our child. I wish you had known." At that very moment, however, she suddenly felt a hot, burning pain from within her stomach that made her eyes fly open immediately. She was certain that the pain had come from Beardic slashing her with its claws, but as soon as she opened her eyes, Dilia was stunned to see that the Pokémon towering over her had not moved a muscle. In fact, the large ice bear seemed frozen in place with its arms still raised above its head. Not only that, but Beardic's claws had stopped glowing completely. She just stared at the large Pokémon in confusion. Beardic was looking at her with an expression of complete awe, amazement and a little of what also appeared to be fear upon its face. She was confused as to why this giant, powerhouse of a Pokémon would be scared or afraid of her in any way, shape or form. That was until, at least, she realized that Beardic wasn't looking at her but was instead looking down. More specifically, it was staring at her stomach. Dilia instantly thought something was wrong and glanced down at her own belly as well. What she saw was beyond anything she would ever have expected to see in her wildest dreams. Her stomach, or more precisely the inside of her stomach, was glowing a bright blue color. It was so bright, in fact, it almost looked like Dilia had swallowed a star that was shining brightly within her. She hesitantly put her hand to her belly and instantly felt a very warm, pulsing sensation meet her palm. It felt like 100 little heartbeats or pinpricks pulsing into her hand, and the raw energy that the blue glow was giving off made Dilia feel completely relaxed and at ease. Like she would never know the feeling of stress or pain again. She was so mesmerized from staring at her stomach and feeling the warmth that the shining, bright blue energy gave off that it took her a while to register the fact that a much bigger and hairier hand had suddenly laid itself on top of her belly as well. Dilia looked up at the owner of the hand and was surprised to see that it belonged to Beardic. Instead of getting scared, however, for reasons she could not fathom, she just looked at the Pokémon and tried to figure out what it was doing and why. The ice-type bear had an amazed look in its eyes. It was staring so intently at her belly that Dilia was afraid the Pokémon would bore a hole straight through it. Beardic looked as though it understood something in that moment that was of such great importance, she herself would never be able to fully comprehend it herself. Slowly, the The carnivorous Pokémon withdrew its paw and then turned around and started walking away. There was no rhyme or reason to it, Beardic simply began wandering off. Not only was she forgotten but also the mother Ursaring and her baby as well. She watched it go on its way until the bipedal Pokémon disappeared over the crest of the hill and onto somewhere else in the ranch. As soon as it vanished though, Dilia started swaying back and forth until she finally fell backwards. Before she could hit the ground however, she was suddenly caught in a pair of large, furry, strong arms that carefully and gently cradled her. Looking up, she saw the mother Ursaring that had been in danger mere moments before now staring down at her with the same expression on her face that Beardic had worn. Before Dilia could say or do anything though, she slowly slipped away from consciousness and then passed out from exhaustion. She never noticed the fact that her stomach had still been glowing in that same strange blue color. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX her head. As she slowly sat up and looked around, she realized that she was in the main living area and tea room of Professor Oak's lab upstairs, lying on a green sofa. The room itself was small and cozy. It had a coffee table in the center of the room, two dark green couches on either side of the table and also two armchair recliners, of the same color, on the other ends. There was a window behind the couch Delia was laying on and it gave a nice view of the expansive fields of the Oak Ranch outside. On one end of the room was a computer sitting on a desk and on another wall, several bookshelves were lined up that were full of reading material on many different subjects, and not all of them were on Pokémon either. There were also paintings hanging on the walls not occupied by bookshelves. Mostly of Pokémon and also framed sketches that the professor himself had drawn as a younger man back in his trainer days. There were two doors, one on one end of the room and the other on the far side. One lead out onto the elevated loft that was above the main ground floor research area of the lab. The other, meanwhile, went into a quaint little spare bedroom with a bathroom that guests visiting the professor would stay in. His own living quarters was downstairs, in an entirely different section of the lab meant only for dwelling. Breaking from the observation of her surroundings, she soon heard footsteps and looked towards the door just as Professor Oak walked in. When he saw her, however, he immediately rushed over as quick as he could. "Delia, are you okay?" the older man asked in urgent concern. She cleared her throat and got her thoughts together before answering him. "Yes, Professor, I'm fine, I think. But, what happened and how did I get here?" The grandfatherly professor sat beside of her before answering. "I do not know, Delia. An Ursaring brought you up here to the lab with its cub nearly 30 minutes ago. You were unconscious and it looked extremely flustered as it cradled you in its arms. Was the Ursaring okay? What about her cub? Or either of them hurt?" Delia began firing questions off at him rapidly, but he simply held up a hand to calm her down. Once she finally did, he gave an answer to her questions. "Yes, Delia, they were both fine. The mother was a little banged up, but after I sprayed some super potion on her, she was just fine. Now tell me, what happened to you?" Delia was relieved to know that the mother and cub were fine, and so, with that knowledge, she started to relax. She took a few deep breaths and then explained everything that happened to Professor Oak. From the Beardic attacking to her body moving of its own accord and making her stand in the way of the attack. She even told of the extremely strange phenomenon that happened with her stomach and how the Pokémon itself acted just as strangely before leaving. All the way up until she passed out. The older man listened with rapt attention. Even after all of his years studying Pokémon and witnessing some very strange events, he had never heard of something quite like that happening before. "What do you think about it, Professor?" Delia asked with a bit of concern in her voice as soon as she finished her story. The elder researcher broke from his thoughts and then looked right at her, squarely. "I don't know what happened, Delia. In all my years as a researcher, nothing like that has ever happened before to my knowledge. That I have heard of at least." She looked even more concerned at those words. "Then what do I do about it, Professor? What if this strange energy is harmful to my baby in some way? Or what if it happens again?" The famous Pokémon researcher just shook his head. I do not believe that is the case, Delia. The way you described the feel of the energy and the way the Pokémon reacted to it means that I do not think it is dangerous. We will keep a close eye on this though, rest assured. For now, just try and take it easy, okay? He finished with a comforting smile. She still felt a little unsure about the unnaturally odd phenomenon that seemed to surround her unborn child, but with Professor Oak's reassurance, she was able to relax a little more and smiled back at him, nodding in the process. Okay, Professor Oak, thank you. I suppose you're right. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX whole time she had been pregnant, very strange things had been happening to her when it came to Pokémon. Sometimes, when she would be out in the fields of the Oak Ranch, different types of Pokémon would just come up to her and either stare at her stomach intently or even, in some cases, get close enough to actually touch or rub up against her stomach if she was sitting down. Also, the conditions of her pregnancy had been anything but normal. She would sometimes feel very strange sensations in her stomach. The exact same feelings she experienced that day during the incident with Beardick. Her doctors also told her, when she went to get checkups done, that her ultrasounds consistently showed strange waves of energy emanating from her womb. An enigmatic phenomenon that completely perplexed them. Dilia had no idea what had been going on, but it did seem weird that all of those strange things had been happening only since she had become pregnant. I don't know, Professor, it's all just so strange. Nothing about my pregnancy has been normal in comparison to what Amelia told me it should be like. She sighed in exasperation. Well, I'm sure that whatever is going on will be made clear once you finally have that future little Pokémon trainer, he assured with a smile. The young brunette nodded thoughtfully. I hope so, Professor, I hope so. The kindly older man decided to take her mind off of the subject as he reached out to pat her leg. I tell you what, my dear, let's go for a walk in the fields around the lab and check on some of the Pokémon. That always clears my mind when I am posed with something that I cannot seem to understand. She brightened up considerably at that and smiled at the thoughtful Pokémon expert. Sure, Professor, let's go. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX search for some time when Delia began to notice that many of the Pokémon around them seemed agitated. "Professor?" she asked. "Yes, Delia," he replied in a laid-back tone. "The Pokémon seem to be getting very agitated," Delia observed. Professor Oak looked around and saw that she was right. Almost all of the Pokémon that were near them in the immediate area were very restless. And, stranger still, they all seemed to be following the two of them. "You're right, Delia, they are. Very strange indeed." The two had stopped walking by that time and were just taking in the unusual sight all around them. Suddenly, at that same moment, Delia gasped and fell to her knees. "Delia!" The gray-haired professor called out her name worriedly and quickly knelt down beside of her. "What is it?" Delia couldn't even speak, she was in so much pain. It felt just like the incident with Beardick, but instead of the calming, warm sensation that the energy gave off then, this was like 1,000 knives piercing into her stomach. However, even for all of the pain she was feeling right now, Delia had an inkling that she knew exactly what was going on. Her female instinct screamed at her about what was happening and she knew they were right. She could only utter one word to Professor Oak through the intense pain that she was now feeling. "Baby," she gasped. He seemed confused for a moment before realization dawned on him. The baby was coming. "Okay, Delia, let me help you up," the professor instructed gently but firmly as he slowly helped her to her feet. She gasped in pain again and looked at the older man pleadingly. "Please, hospital," she begged desperately. Professor Oak nodded and put his arm around Delia, already starting to guide her back to the lab. "Just hold on, my dear, we'll get you some help." His words were soothing and gentle, but all she felt right now was pain, panic and fear. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX hospital, which was located right in the heart of Palette's small town. She had since been checked into her room and was currently waddling back and forth in her hospital gown while holding her large belly and grimacing in intense discomfort. "It hurts so bad," the suffering woman gasped as she felt a smaller contraction ripple through her body. "I know, my dear, I know. Just keep breathing and it will pass," Professor Oak said reassuringly as he stood near her just in case he was needed. "These are only contractions, Delia, and you will continue to feel these as you come closer to going into full labor." After a few moments went by, the pain did indeed finally subside and she took a much-needed breather. At the same time, there was a knock on the door of Delia's room, and after a quick, "Come in," by Professor Oak, it opened and in came Amelia, his daughter. Her own almost 8-year-old daughter, Daisy, was following behind her. Amelia was a rather attractive young woman. She stood at Delia's height of about 5 feet 4 inches and had dark brown, wavy hair that she let fall down her shoulders. Her face was quite pretty and her skin was flawless. Her eyes were of a darker shade, much like her father's own, though not eerily so. She wore a long white, floral patterned skirt, a yellow blouse and a cream-colored cotton jacket that she had over the blouse. She also had a silver chain around her neck that bore a small sapphire on the end and a matching bracelet on her right wrist. On her feet were simple black slip-ons. Daisy was almost an exact copy of her mother, only with lighter brown hair that she kept pulled away from her forehead with a tan hair band. Her eyes were a lighter shade of brown though, unlike her mother and grandfather. She wore a pair of red jeans with a black belt, a white blouse and a black overshirt that looked like a vest, which she wore over top of the blouse. Her feet were covered in simple white sneakers and unlike her mother, she didn't wear any jewelry. "Ah, Amelia, I'm glad you got my message. Did you have any trouble getting here?" the older man asked his daughter as he looked toward her with a smile. Amelia walked up and hugged first her father, then Delia, before replying to his question while Daisy ran up to hug her grandfather tightly. "Aside from finding someone to watch Gary, no, we didn't have any problems getting here. However, there is something incredible happening outside. If you turn on the TV to channel 8 then you should see what I'm talking about. There are news crews everywhere outside." After standing up from hugging his granddaughter, Samuel Oak allowed curiosity to get the better of him and went over to grab the remote for the TV that was suspended on the wall opposite Delia's bed. At the same time, Amelia helped her friend over to the bed and assisted her in laying down to rest while the professor sat on the end of the bed. Soon, Daisy hopped up into her grandfather's lap. "Do you need anything?" Amelia asked as she sat on the chair next to the bedside. Delia shook her head tiredly. "No thank you, Amelia, I just want to have my baby and get this over with." She then looked away for a second before glancing back at her friend nervously. How is it, giving birth?" Amelia could see the apprehension on her friend's face and she just gave her a warm smile in return. "It's not horrible if you just keep reminding yourself why you are doing what you're doing. Just keep imagining that you will be holding your child in your arms soon and everything will be fine, I promise." The younger woman appeared visibly calmer after hearing her friend's words of advice and found a new determination in her. "Thank you, Amelia. I really appreciate you being here." Oak's daughter hugged her again, which Delia returned in kind. "Anytime, Delia. Anytime. We're like sisters, you know. Family." At that moment, Professor Oak found the correct channel on TV and turned up the volume. Together, they all watched the news channel that was currently flashing, breaking news. At the bottom of the screen, an attractive-looking blonde woman, wearing glasses and dressed in a blue ladies' business suit, appeared on the screen with a microphone in hand as she sat strapped to what looked like a seat inside of a helicopter. Naturally, she was speaking loudly over the noise of the chopper. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX watching. My name is Diana Ringgold and this our story. A strange phenomenon has Pokémon researchers and experts baffled all across the Kanto region and even throughout the whole world today. Just hours ago, Pokémon of all types, shapes, sizes and varieties began mobilizing from several different locations all across the region and started moving as one large group. All of them heading in a single direction. Experts were able to track where exactly the Pokémon seemed to be headed and were surprised to find their apparently intended destination. It is a small town only hours away from Viridian City called Pallet Town, home of the world-renowned Pokémon researcher, Professor Samuel Oak. For some reason, this small community has seemed to attract the interest of several of the Pokémon from right here in the Kanto region, and now, the mass exodus of them has decided to congregate into this one small location. Even more surprising is that the Pokémon apparently have a specific destination within Pallet Town that they are headed to. The scene on the TV suddenly changed to give an aerial view from the helicopter of the very same hospital that Dilia and the others were currently in. What was stunning though, at least to them, was the fact that the hospital was literally surrounded, on all sides and for some distance, by a huge crowd of Pokémon. There were even flying types descending down onto the roof of the hospital itself and roosting on it. As you can all clearly see, the woman began speaking again. Pokémon in numbers well into the hundreds have all surrounded this medical facility down below that is known as the Pokémon Ranger Memorial Hospital. From land-bound to flying, just about every species of Pokémon is present at this time. The only kind not currently gathered at this mass congregation would be the marine life Pokémon. This particular group has compensated for their absence by coming as close to the shore in Pallet Town Harbor as they possibly can and are now staring off into the exact direction of this very hospital. Yet again, the scene on TV shifted to an aerial view from another helicopter, and this one showed a real-time video of the harbor that lay just a short distance away from Pallet Town proper itself. The picture showed that the waters all throughout the harbor and even a little farther out to sea were all full of countless water Pokémon. Each of them were staring off into the same direction on land to boot. No one has been able to offer any kind of explanation as to why the Pokémon are behaving in this manner. The scene shifted again to the same view of the hospital as before while Diana went on. The strangest thing, one expert on Pokémon behavior stated, is that these Pokémon all seem to have a very focused interest on this particular hospital and nothing else. What the reason could be is anyone's guess, including my own. However, there is no denying that, for the past 9 months approximately, Pokémon around the world have been acting extremely unusual and with no particular reason for their behavior. Could all of these strange occurrences be connected? What could be the reason for all of these Pokémon's very out-of-character behavior? This reporter only wishes she had the answer. We will be keeping you all informed and updated on this very puzzling and mysterious series of events as they progress. Again, I am Diana Ringgold and this has been Channel -8 News. Thank you for watching. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX the program ended. No one could believe that just outside of the hospital they were in, hundreds of Pokémon were gathered in a large mass. Even Professor Oak was apparently shocked, as he hadn't said a word since the end of the broadcast. And for him to be shocked or surprised about anything to do with Pokémon must have meant that it was a very unusual situation. Amelia looked at her father. "What do you think is causing this, Dad?" Professor Oak still looked shocked as he turned around to answer his daughter. "I honestly have no idea, Amelia. Never in all my years as a Pokémon researcher have I seen something like this take place." He then turned to Delia, whom also seemed shocked about what they had just seen on TV, and they both shared a look with each other that reminded them yet again how all of this seemed eerily linked to her pregnancy. Before anything else could be said amongst the group, however, the door to the room flew open and in marched a news crew shouting for Professor Oak. They were followed closely by a few nurses who were desperately trying to get them to leave. "Professor Oak," a tall and lanky male reporter shouted while running up to the surprised researcher. "Do you have any comments on what is causing the world's Pokémon to behave in such a fashion?" After a few moments to compose himself, and wondering just who told them where he was, Oak began to reply to the reporter's hurried question while Daisy climbed off his lap. "No, I have no idea what is causing this phenomenon. I am just as baffled by this as everyone else is. I do not. Professor Oak, could you please come with us outside and at least give a formal interview and explain your theories as to why this at least could be happening? Another reporter, this one a dark-haired woman, pressed with her microphone shoved into the older man's face. Before he could say anything else in reply, Dilia suddenly gasped in pain as another contraction hit her hard. The professor, after looking back and seeing this, allowed his face to grow stern as he looked sharply back at the news crew before speaking firmly and in a tone that left no room to argue. I have already stated that I have no idea what is causing this debacle, and that is my final word on the subject. Now, if you will please excuse me, my surrogate daughter here is in labor and she is the one who needs my presence the most right now. Good day to you. With that, he turned to Dilia again and sat back down on the bed to offer his support to her. The news crew and reporters just stood there meanwhile, dumbfounded at the professor's firm rejection to their insistent request for an interview. The nurses took that opportunity and quickly shooed the reporters away, offering an apology to Dilia, Professor Oak and Amelia as they did so before exiting the room themselves. Dilia herself soon let out another cry of pain as the contraction worsened. Amelia automatically took one of Delia's hands while Professor Oak grabbed the other one. After a few very long moments, the pain finally went away and allowed her to relax a little. Afterward, she smiled in gratitude to Amelia, which the other mother returned brightly. Dilia then turned to Professor Oak. Thank you for what you did a minute ago, Professor. You didn't have to stay here. The kindly older man just smiled warmly. Of course I did, Dilia. You are like another daughter to me. Even though I would like to see this massive gathering of Pokémon for myself, you are much more important. Amelia took that moment to chime in as well. That's right, sweetie. You and that little one inside of you are like family to us. We would rather be here than anywhere else in the world right now. Dilia looked at her surrogate family for a second and became a little teary-eyed before she replied. Thank you so much, you two. I don't know what I would do without you. You are most welcome, my dear, Professor Oak returned with a gentle hand squeeze and nod. Yeah, any time, Del. Now, let's hear some of those names that you've been thinking of for the baby. Amelia suggested eagerly. Dilia formed an excited look on her face at that idea, and then the two women began happily discussing potential names for the future little Ketchum. Professor Oak, for his part, just looked on and smiled fondly at the two beauties he proudly called his daughters. At the same time, he pulled Daisy back into his lap and shared a smile with his granddaughter, whom smiled back sweetly and cuddled into her grandpa. Unbeknownst to people and Pokémon alike, however, a great council was about to be held. One that hadn't been assembled in 1,000 years. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX legends and storybooks. The cradle where all life began and the idea for it was conceived. A place that some swore was real, namely those who fancied to believe in the unseen and mystical. Yet, by others, for those classified as the more science-minded, it was not but a fairy tale. The dreamers, however, would have won the day because that place was very much real. And it was called the Hall of Origins. The original Hall of Originations, or, as commonly known, the Hall of Origins, was only called as such because, by human definition, it was the best names one could give to describe it with such limited knowledge and understanding. The otherworldly realm began at a point that had a magnificent golden doorway, which was studded with a wide variety of dazzlingly beautiful, gleaming gemstones and jewels embedded into its surface, set into a great white wall behind it. Stretching out from the door was a long hall that was comprised of white flooring, walls and a ceiling that was crafted of some smooth, perfectly formed material not found in the mortal world. So perfect and splendorous was the look of the white surfaces, which appeared whiter than even the purest blanket of snow, that to human eyes, the brightness of the soft glow everything gave off would have hurt their eyes. Perhaps even permanently damaged or blinded them. The hall itself had massive pillars, perfectly cylindrical and ornate, spaced out at very exact distances from the doorway to the end of the hall, which were not even a fraction of a centimeter off. They stretched from the pristine, unscuffed floor all the way up to the ceiling, which was far above. Even the walls were distanced some ways apart from one another. The pillars themselves were draped in what looked like some kind of white and golden tapestry that faced the hallway and stretched from floor to ceiling on that side alone. Also, in between each pillar on both sides of the hall were small pedestals that had pristinely carved, utterly flawless statues of the legendaries themselves placed upon them. Each one was posed in a different way, but the carvings captured their regal grace, elegance, raw power and poise well. As with the hall and everything else in it, the statues appeared to be made from some form of white mineral that shone with radiance and appeared to make the small statues seem alive. Most incredibly, of everything, was how every square inch of the hall from floor, wall to ceiling was covered in intricately worked etchings of Pokémon. The small but incredibly detailed images were numerous, beyond count, and they could be seen for every single inch that the long entryway extended. The floor of the hall, starting at the great door, was covered in a rich purple carpet-like material, which gleamed like stars were woven into its fabric, and went all the way to the end of the hall itself. Yet, even further still it continued on as the hallway finally came out into a much larger, dome-shaped chamber that was as finely crafted and perfectly designed as the entryway that led to it. This new room was truly of a vast size. The floor-to-ceiling gap in height was the expanse of at least 5 Gyarados stacked on top of one another, and the width from wall to wall was easily the distance of 3 stretched tail to tail in a perfect line. The circular chamber had a glass dome at the very top, in the exact center of the ceiling, and through it could be seen the most breathtaking sight of millions of stars, planets, small swirling galaxies out in the vast distance, and other awe-inspiring views of what appeared to be outer space. The chamber, like the hallway before it, had carvings and etchings of Pokémon all throughout its expanse. The floor, the walls and the ceiling were covered in the designs. Even the glass dome itself somehow had images of Arceus children engraved into the crystal-clear surface. All along the walls, in a total circumference, there were bright red tapestries hanging and, like every other colored thing in the heavenly realm, the vibrancy of the colors themselves were unearthly and vivid in ways that the mortal eye could not discern. Right in front of all of the tapestries there were more small pedestals with statues of the legendary and mythical Pokémon on them. This made it seem that, between the carvings and all of the etchings of normal Pokémon that were found all throughout the Hall of Origins, every single species of the amazing creatures, both known and as of yet unknown on Earth, was portrayed there. At the front of the room was the only deviation in design. It came in the form of there being a raised, elevated platform which looked down on the rest of the oval-shaped chamber. The purple, star-studded carpeting went all the way through the chamber and ended at the base of the platform itself. At the back of the elevated space, hanging all down along the wall, were multiple tapestries. Each one was a different color and appeared to have some kind of a coffin-shaped, stone-like plate attached to it. The plates themselves were all a different, vibrant color that shone with radiant light, and the tapestries they clung to were the same color as the plate each one held. There were 17 plates in all, but, oddly enough, 5 were missing from the set, which left only the tapestries themselves, though vacant of the objects that should have been attached to them. Most interestingly, beneath all of the plates, even the ones that seemed to be missing, there was embroidery work on the tapestry itself. And in that embroidery were words written in the textual shapes of unknown. In order, they each read, Meadow Plate. When the universe was created, its shards became this plate. X. Flame Plate. The power of defeated giants infuses this plate. X. Aqua Plate. 2 beings of time and space set free from the original one. X. Sky Plate. 3 beings were born to bind time and space. X. Insect Plate. 2 make matter and 3 make spirit, shaping the world. X. Toxic Plate. The original one breathed alone before the universe came. X. Zap Plate. The powers of plates are shared among Pokémon. X. Mind Plate. The rightful bearer of a plate draws from the plate it holds. X. Stone Plate. Alone the powers are great, but together they make the original whole. X. Earth Plate. If all are separated, then the original one would fall, and with it, creation. X. Dread Plate. A true heart may gather all together and restore that which was broken. X. Spirit Plate. For the one given to the original shall soon come forth and bring order from chaos. X. Iron Plate. The original gave shape but to it was given form as well, though it knows not where. X. Battle Plate. When the reemergence draws near, the one shall rise and make whole once more the original. X. Ice Plate. For together they both shall fulfill the destiny of the other that was made before the beginning. X. Draco Plate. Of it there is no knowledge or understanding, even to the original from whose will it was made. X. Pixie Plate. Yet still the other watches and it knows, and of its great will this tale only tells little. This great and wondrous dimension was the realm that Arceus, the great god Pokémon and creator of all things, called her home. It was in this splendid and magnificent hall that all of the legendary and mythical Pokémon from Kanto to Galar on Earth was now gathered. And at the very front of the hall, standing before all of her mighty children atop the raised platform in the oval chamber, was Arceus herself. As she gazed upon her gathered legendary children, Arceus was contemplating many things at once. After today, everything was going to change forever. And not just for the humans and Pokémon on Earth but for all of the legendary Pokémon, herself included. She was left to wonder if the world was truly ready yet for the birth of the one she had been destined to choose. In the end though, she decided that she was done contemplating and wondering. The decision had been made long ago and she was just going to have faith that the world truly was ready for the coming of the chosen one. Arceus was suddenly broken from her pondering though when Dialga, the ruler of time, addressed her. Mother Arceus, he spoke in a deep voice. What has caused you to summon us all here like this? Yes, I must wonder the same thing, mother. A meeting like this has not been called for in over 1,000 years. Since the time of Sir Aaron, to be precise. Cresselia, the lunar Pokémon, spoke up in a graceful feminine voice. Many of the other legendaries nodded their heads in agreement. Arceus finally made her voice known and it was like many ringing bells. Full of power, grace and feminine dignity. My children, the world is changing. Things are not as they were 1,000 years ago during the time of Sir Aaron. The land is no longer torn by war and ravaged by death. There are still problems, yes, but the humans have grown in the 1,000 years that we have remained mostly absent from the affairs of the world. In the time we have been in our self-imposed isolation, many of us has all but passed into the myths and legends of human stories. And fine by me too. Came the low, growling, guttural voice of Groudon the continent Pokémon. The last thing I remember of humans was them killing each other in droves. I'm glad to be nothing more than a memory in their pathetic minds. I agree with Groudon, Cobalion asserted in a strong male tone. They tried, on more than one occasion, to kill myself and the other swords of justice. The humans lost our trust long ago. His companions Virizion and Terrakion just nodded their heads in agreement. The youngest of the swords of justice, Keldeo, argued back. Come on Cobalion, the humans can't be that bad. The eldest of the non-singing quartet glared at Keldeo. You have no idea what humans are capable of, Keldeo. You were not around to see the humans' evil deeds like we did 1,000 years ago. Yeah, Terrakion intervened in a brutish and rough voice. You aren't even a full sword of justice yet either, so hold your tongue. You were lucky to even be invited to this meeting. Now that isn't fair, Terrakion, Virizion intervened patiently and calmly. She turned to face Keldeo, who seemed dejected at Terrakion's last comment and was hanging his head in shame. Keldeo, do not listen to Terrakion. You will make a superb sword of justice one day, I know you will. You just need more practice and time. However, both Cobalion and Terrakion are right about the humans. You were not there to see the evil acts they performed so long ago. Keldeo raised his head and looked at her. Thanks Virizion, you're right. I do need to just be patient and keep training. Then someday, I'll be a great sword of justice. Just like you three. He paused for a second before continuing. And I also apologize. I really wasn't around to see what you, Terrakion and Cobalion saw 1,000 years ago. Forgive me. Virizion smiled and nodded her head, accepting the young initiate's apology. Suddenly though, Rayquaza spoke up in a decidedly male voice. It was firm and aggressive. Mother Arceus, you say the humans are different and have changed. Well, what about those devices called Pokeballs that they put our fellow kind inside of? I have seen the humans capture more of our kind than I can count over the many years that I have watched from my post as Guardian of the Skies. And what about how the humans force our kind to do battle with each other on their behalf for nothing more than sport? Palkia, the ruler of space, shouted in an enraged female voice. Or we can talk about all of the other meaningless acts of servitude that the humans force upon our kind. The nightmare-causing Pokémon, Darkrai, chimed in with his usual emotionless voice. Or even the ones who call themselves Pokémon trainers. Many of these so-called trainers have spent years pursuing we few legendaries that have remained active in the world, and for nothing more than to use us and our power in what they call Pokémon battles. He crossed his shadowy arms and his unnerving eyes gleamed. I, for one, have a particular human that has been pursuing me for years, trying to capture me and then use me for his own selfish ends. Come now everyone, Jirachi spoke up in his meek, gentle, mellow voice. I believe you are all overreacting about the issues with the humans. Easy for you to say. Thunderous retorted angrily. You are only awake and around the humans for a week at a time and then you go back to sleep for 1,000 years. You have not even seen half of what the humans are capable of, so you have no room to talk. That is right. Tornadus joined in just as aggressively. It is easy for many of you to talk. Almost all of you have been in your own states of hibernation or seclusion for the last 1,000 years, while only a few of us have remained awake and active in the world. The few of us that remained have had centuries to see the evil of humanity firsthand for ourselves. If it wasn't for Mother Arceus summoning all of us here today in spirit form, most of you would still be sleeping peacefully or remaining in hiding while the rest of us suffer. As soon as this was said, a loud argument broke out amongst all of the legendaries. Shouting and yelling was the only thing heard in the Hall of Origins until Arceus finally broke her long silence and bellowed in a rage-filled voice that shook the chamber, "Enough." Everyone stopped fighting at once and the hall quickly grew still. I am ashamed at all of you. How dare you fight in this most sacred of places? You are each supposed to be the guardians of not just your fellow Pokémon but the world as well. And that includes the humans. Arceus took a second to calm herself before continuing in a more calm and controlled tone. Now I know that the Great War from Sir Aaron's time ruined many of your views concerning the humans, and, yes, it was a horrible and dark time. But did you all forget so easily the brave men and women that stood up and defended both people and Pokémon alike from those evil humans? Or when Sir Aaron himself gave his own life to save the Tree of Beginning? Arceus continued to look at her children sternly as she spoke. Humans and Pokémon alike worked together back then to save the world. That is the way it has been ever since the first human and Pokémon met one another. You say that humans control Pokémon and make them do their bidding against the Pokémon's will. She shook her head slowly. Humans and Pokémon live and work alongside each other in harmony, helping each other to achieve their goals and to make the world a better place. Whether it be trainers and their Pokémon fighting alongside one another to get stronger and to bring the best out in each other, or by merely working together however they can to achieve simple goals. Pokémon and people need one another, it is the balance of the world. Arceus paused for a moment, surveying all of her children, before continuing. There are bad humans, we all know that. And yes, they can be evil and deceitful, but for as many bad humans as there are in the world, there are just as many good ones who stand up and fight those who do wrong. The mighty creator tipped her in acknowledgement. It is as that organization of humans who call themselves Pokémon Rangers. They fight for the good of everyone, people and Pokémon alike. Arceus looked away from the other legendaries for a long moment before, eventually, she picked up where she left off. As you all know, when I saved the valley known as Mykina, in the Sinnoh region, from an asteroid that was going to destroy it and much more, I also used some of my own life aura to create the Jewel of Life. It was a great and powerful sphere that was made by combining the Aqua, Meadow, Earth, Zap and Draco plates into one. She looked up at the glass dome above, as if in deep remembrance. During my struggle against the asteroid, I lost all of my plates. I would have died as well, it is highly likely, unless the leader of the small riverside town in Mycena, Damos, would not have found one of my plates and returned it to me. This in turn gave me enough power to call the other plates to myself and restore my life force. And it was for that great act of kindness that I created the Jewel of Life in the first place. Arceus looked back at her children again. During the struggle against the asteroid, several smaller meteorites had fallen and ravaged the landscape, leaving it a barren wasteland. I created the Jewel of Life and gave it to Damos in order that he might use it to restore Mycena to its once prosperous and abundant state. The god Pokémon closed her eyes for a moment. He knew that I was only giving it to him temporarily while I returned here to rest and recover my strength. I told him that when I returned, I would reclaim the Jewel of Life. However, she opened her eyes again. When I finally came back to retrieve it some years later, Damos betrayed and attacked me and kept the jewel for himself. In my still weakened state I was forced to flee and come back here. I was angry for many years with not only Damos but with all of humanity as well for betraying me. After hundreds of years passed however and the Jewel of Life became lost in time, I had to accept what had happened. It was not all of humanity who betrayed me, just one man. Every single one of the legendaries was as silent as death while listening to Arceus. Reshiram finally was the first one to speak in her powerful, dignified voice. But why did you forgive the humans so easily, Mother Arceus? How could you possibly forgive them? Arceus merely smiled at her child. Because, my dear, you cannot hold the actions of one human against millions of others. We all have light and dark inside of us. It is which side we choose to act on that defines who we are. The humans are just as much my children and creations as you and all of the other Pokémon are. The many other legendary Pokémon had, by that point, calmed down and were now taking in what their creator had just told them. Giratina was the first to speak in his chilling and low voice. Mother Arceus, you said that the world was changing. What did you mean by that? The other legendaries looked at her expectantly, curious now as to what she meant by that statement earlier. Arceus knew that the time had come for her to divulge everything to her children. She looked off into the distance for a time before beginning her revelation, and when she did, it was with the utmost seriousness. The time is soon upon us when we will have to make ourselves known to the world again. All of us. Every legendary Pokémon's eyes widened considerably before any of them even thought about speaking. Zekrom finally came out of his own shock though and was the first to say something. What do you mean by, make ourselves known, Mother Arceus? Why? And how are we even supposed to awaken? Some of us have been trapped in energy-containing prisons or locked away in different parts of the world for hundreds of years, preventing us from taking physical form. Reshiram and myself are currently sealed away inside of the Dark and Light Stones respectively. How can we be free? Arceus answered Zekrom's question directly to him. While it is true that, ever since the Great War and passing of Sir Aaron, most of us have been locked away in isolation, such as yourself and Reshiram, or even Groudon and Kyogre, there will be a series of events in the near future that will release you from your prisons. How, though, Mother Arceus, and when will these events take place? Little Mew asked in her childlike and innocent voice. Arceus looked down at her inquisitive daughter, whom was the ancestor of all Pokémon, and smiled fondly at her before replying. These events will start taking place just a few years before Jirachi is supposed to wake up again. The wish-granting Pokémon perked up at hearing his name and from being reminded that he would be awakening soon after sleeping for 1,000 years. As for how you will become free of your imprisonment, that will be much less desirable. Arceus spoke this part sadly and also with a hint of anger in her proud and regal voice. The legendaries all seemed confused at that statement. Though she continued on and answered their unspoken questions. In just a few years' time, several evil human groups that will each be fighting for its own nefarious agenda will rise in each region. They will seek to control your legendary powers and use them for their own selfish purposes. There was an uproar from many of the indignant and prouder legendary Pokémon who refused to be controlled by anyone, especially humans. However, one loud silence from Arceus was enough to silence the clamor. Once the outrage finally calmed down, she spoke again. You did not let me finish. You see, none of you will face these threats alone. And these evil groups of men and women will not prevail in their diabolical plans. The world will not face these dark times to come alone. Does this mean that you will help us and the world when the time calls for it, Mother? Ho-Oh asked curiously, the feminine-sounding legendary at least feeling a little more hopeful now for she and her siblings. Arceus shook her head. No, it will not be me. In fact, I will endure my own great challenge that I will need help as well to face. She looked off into the distance for a moment. You see, my children, a human will become our savior. And not just ours either, but the whole world's savior. For both people and Pokémon alike. Many of the legendaries appeared utterly disbelieving. And who would this human be, Mother Arceus? The time travel Pokémon, Celebi, asked perplexed. Every other legendary was fixated on what Arceus would say next. She stared at each of her children for a long period of time and then finally said the words that made every single legendary Pokémon in the hall become as still as stone. The one mentioned in the oldest of prophecies. Arceus looked back at her remaining elemental plates on the wall. The prophecy mentioned upon the writing on these tapestries, in fact. The same one who has been foretold to usher in the dawn of a new age. The one whose very existence is interwoven with my own even though I myself do not know why. It is the same one whom we have waited thousands of years for, my children, the chosen one. If there had been pins in the Hall of Origins and one fell, then everyone would have heard it hit the ground like a thunder attack. Did they just hear correctly? That was the question on all of their minds. Mother Arceus had just told them that the fabled and legendary chosen one was going to finally arise. After they had all waited for countless millennia. It could not be so, it simply could not be. Mother Arceus, this cannot be, can it? Has the time finally come? Lugia questioned while still in utter shock. Arceus looked upon all of her children and nodded. Yes, my children, it is true. The coming of the Chosen One is nearly upon us. It is for this very reason that I summoned you all here today. The rest of the legendaries continued to listen with rapt attention as their creator continued. The Chosen One is being born into the world at this very moment. In a small human hospital just outside of a small community known as Pallet Town. Hundreds of Pokémon are already gathered at this one location, awaiting the child's birth. The world's Pokémon have known of the child since his conception and have eagerly been awaiting his arrival. So that is the reason behind our brothers and sisters' crazy behavior. Landorus loudly exclaimed. All of the Pokémon in the Unova region have been doing unusually kind things for each other and for humans. The same can be said for Johto, announced Suicune. And Hoenn, chimed in Rayquaza. Sinnoh as well, chirped Mesprit, Uxie and Azulf all at once like the triplets they were. The Kalos region Pokémon have been in a strange state as well, Xerneas and Yveltal likewise proclaimed. Solgaleo and Lunala shared a look between them both before the four-legged, powerful psychic, steel type gave a brisk nod. We too have noticed strange happenings in Alola. Tapu Koko and the others have as well. Though we assumed that it had something to do with more of those infernal ultra beasts causing trouble again. Zacian and Zamazenta looked at one another as well. Finally, the shield-bearing Pokémon spoke gruffly. Galar has been experiencing rather unusual phenomenon as well. And don't forget the Kanto region. Because it is the home region of the Chosen One, Pokémon in Kanto have been behaving the most out of character. Mew piped up cutely as she spun around in the air. It was almost as if she was happy that the one they had all waited for would be appearing in the region she was most associated with. Yes, the Pokémon of the world have known of his coming. They are very excited because even without the knowledge that we possess, they still sense that the Chosen One's arrival means great and positive change is on the horizon. They have been performing these acts of kindness as a sign of good faith and goodwill towards the Chosen One himself, Arceus revealed. Mother Arceus, what can you tell us of this Chosen One? What is his role and how do we fit into all of this? Meloda asked in a sweetly curious way. Arceus appeared thoughtful for a moment and then spoke loudly and clearly after a short time. Almost as though she were trying to decide exactly what she could and couldn't reveal to her legendary children. Ah, my young ones, many of these things are a mystery and must remain so. The only thing that I can say to you now about him is that he will be a human unlike any you have ever before met. Who knows? He just might change some of your own hearts for the better toward humanity." Arceus heard some of her more stubborn and headstrong children scoff at the last part she said, but all it brought to her was a sense of amusement. Regardless, she looked up at the glass dome above that allowed an unfettered access of the vastness of the universe itself. Then, beside of her, the god Pokémon opened up a small, shining portal which started to play scenes from Earth. These were scenes of Pokémon and people all over the world, going about their daily lives and living as any other day. As she showed her children these scenes, Arceus looked into the portal as well and started to speak again. The human beings are a young and foolish race in many ways, yes. Here, she showed them images of humans performing acts of crime and violence against each other and Pokémon, which made many of the legendaries in the hall growl or look on in distaste. But, she then started to show them scenes of people and Pokémon working and striving together across the whole globe as they helped, aided and assisted one another in making the world a better place. Working, playing and cooperating just as if they were two halves of the same whole. They also carry the potential for great and wondrous things. They need someone to guide them on their way to achieving that potential. So that is why I give them the destined chosen one that was promised to us all. Here, the scene shifted to the image of a shadowy figure, a man, standing atop a high hill while he looked down onto the people and Pokémon of the world. It was dark and many appeared to be groping around as they tried to find their way. They will struggle and fall behind him, but eventually. The scene changed once again as the man turned to face the rising sun, and suddenly, the whole world was bathed in light. And just like that, the people and Pokémon of the world found their footing, set their faces toward the rising sun and began following the figure into the horizon. They will join him in the sunlight. As Arceus finished her small speech and gazed upon her children, all was silent. One could tell that many of the legendaries were going over what they just heard in their heads, trying to process everything. Cresselia, though, broke the silence. "But what is our roles in this matter, Mother? And how do we fit into place with the Chosen One's destiny?" Arceus knew that this was not going to be accepted well. At all. Being the Chosen One means that he will face many hardships and have to overcome several great hurdles in his lifetime. This will be no easy task, and he will be in need of much assistance throughout his life if he is going to succeed in his destiny. You, my children, will have to at some point assist and help him along on his journey. In whatever way seems most beneficial to you at the time. Silence greeted her proclamation for some time, with some of the legendaries merely remaining silent. A few simply didn't know what to think, and others were not so opposed to the idea. However, there was indeed a vocal minority that made a very large uproar. Those among them being Groudon, Entei, Cobalion, Terrakion, the forces of nature, and Kyurem. Never. I would rather be captured and put into a circus. I will never work with a human. I would sooner surrender all control of the land to Kyogre. The loud protesting continued for a time until Arceus' rage was kindled and she bellowed in a voice that once more shook the entirety of the Hall of Origins. Enough. All the caterwaul came to an end immediately, but she turned her fiercely intense and angry glare on all of her children. Once more, you should feel ashamed of yourselves. The Chosen One is the best chance that all of you have to avoid terrible fates, and some of you are judging him like this before he has even been born from his mother's womb. Despicable. All of the legendaries had the decency to look down and say nothing in rebuttal, especially the ones responsible for the uproar. Yet still, she went on. This young one shall live a life fraught with peril and danger, I foresee, and if he is as the prophecy says, this boy shall most likely risk his own life for the sake of yours. Many times over. Her strict gaze continued to pan across all of her children. Now, I understand that many of you have been hurt and badly betrayed by humans in the past. Your mistrust now is understandable, but nonetheless, I demand of all of you that you at least give the Chosen One a chance. Whether it changes your view or not, I fully expect all of you to at least be civil. And that most certainly means no violence against him. She shot an extra stern glare at Groudon when she said this, and the continent Pokémon in question had enough sense and good reason to lower his head and say nothing further. Seeing that the commotion and protesting had been effectively silenced, she nodded in satisfaction and allowed herself to calm. This too included her voice, though it was still firm. Now, from the time the child is born, I will watch over and guide him. When he needs help or a push in the right direction, I will be there for him. So if you will all excuse me, the time of his birth is nearly at hand and I wish to be there to witness it. This council has ended. With that said, many of the legendary Pokémon soon began leaving to go back to their bodies on Earth and to contemplate everything that had just been revealed to them. They did so by walking, levitating or flying out of the circular meeting chamber, back into the long hallway and then through the golden door at its end. However, instead of going through the door, they turned into silvery, spectral images of themselves and disappeared into a swirling white vortex that appeared in the center of the door, showing that it was intended for nothing more than splendorous show. As Arceus was preparing to go to Earth herself via her own portal, two little forms appeared behind her. "Yes, Melota. Mew. What can I do for you?" she asked of her daughters kindly without needing to turn around. All traces of anger she had with some of the other legendaries was forgotten as soon as she looked at the two sweet little Pokémon. Mother Arceus. Mew started. "We were just wondering." Melota picked up where she left. They both then looked at each other and back at Arceus, speaking at the exact same time. "Can we please come with you and witness the chosen one being born?" The mighty Pokémon just looked at her innocent little children, whom appeared so nervous and excited with the cutest looks of hope on their little faces. She couldn't say no even if she wanted to. "Of course my dears. You can most certainly come with me." Both of the small legendaries smiled happily and began celebrating and cheering at that. But Arceus interrupted their celebration. "We cannot be seen under any circumstances, so stay invisible. Understand?" Both of the happy legendaries gave fast nods, showing that they understood. "Good." She nodded her great head once. "Then let us go." After she said that, Arceus opened a portal leading to Earth and shaped the spiraling, glowing vortex until, instead of it showing only a view of just the Earth, it now showed the scene of a hospital building. And not just any hospital either, but one with large letters spelling Pokémon Ranger Memorial Hospital attached to the front. It was also currently surrounded by a large mass of Pokémon and even people. Especially news crews. On the ground outside of the building, behind a large wall of police barriers that kept the Pokémon and human spectators from entering the hospital unless it was an emergency, in the case of the people, were a bunch of policemen and an officer Jenny who were keeping the situation as controlled as possible. All over the lawns of the hospital were the news crews and several reporters, whom were giving the coverage and updates on the event currently taking place. Arceus soon floated through the portal, followed by Melota and Mew. They were instantly transported from the Hall of Origins to floating directly above the hospital. They were invisible now though, so that no one would see them. The Pokémon on the ground seemed to notice the three legendaries' presence immediately and looked up into the sky in their direction. The news crews and everyone else on the ground also looked up to see what had suddenly broken the Pokémon's concentration on the hospital, but they obviously couldn't see anything since the legendaries were invisible to the human eye. Once Arceus asked the large horde of her children below to please ignore their presence, the mass of Pokémon instantly obeyed Arceus' command and looked back towards the hospital. Even though many of them were amazed to have seen their own creator in the flesh. This action effectively took all the people's attention off of where Arceus and the other two legendaries were floating in the sky. She herself looked toward the hospital as well, and after picking up on the rapidly growing energy signature that signaled the impending birth of the Chosen One, she began descending towards the hospital followed by her two legendary children. "This is it," she thought to herself. "The birth of the one who will change the world is finally at hand." XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX for 8 hours and was finally about to give birth to her child. Professor Oak was with Amelia and his granddaughter outside in the waiting room. He had long since been forced out after things started to get very intense and extremely unusual for a routine birth. As soon as Dilia was taken to the delivery room and began the slow, exhausting and painful process of having her baby, the entire atmosphere in the room changed drastically. The air in the delivery room began to feel thick and heavy, and even gravity itself seemed to become denser the longer Dilia was in the process of giving birth. A nearly visible energy, which was radiating sheer power, started to course through the room. The doctors and nurses working with Dilia began to get short of breath, and their bodies started to feel like they had 50-pound weights strapped to their persons, which were heavily weighing them down. Professor Oak himself had become so affected that when he started showing signs of passing out, he was forced to leave the room. The medical staff themselves even began needing to shift out with other doctors and nurses, who were waiting outside the room, just so they could rest and recover the rapidly drained strength in their bodies. No one could stay in the delivery room for too long or risk being seriously injured from the powerful energy that kept rolling off of Dilia in waves. Really, the energy was coming from the child struggling to get free from her body, but no one knew that except for Dilia and Professor Oak. In fact, the doctors and nurses seemed hellbent on explaining the phenomena away as something natural. Like the air quality in the room or the long, hard hours worked on a hot day like the one outside. Even though it was perfectly air-conditioned inside the hospital. The strangest thing though was that Dilia was not affected by the energy radiating from the child in her womb at all. It was possible, of course, that she had developed a resistance to the abnormal energy after dealing with its effects for the last 9 months, but nothing was sure. Arceus, Meloda and Mew were in the far corner of the room, watching everything play out with undivided attention. "Mother, what is this powerful energy coursing through the room?" Meloda inquired. Arceus looked to her daughter and answered her. "This, my child, is but a small taste of the hidden power of the Chosen One. It truly is amazing, even as an unborn infant he still has this much power inside of him. I cannot imagine what it will be like when he grows older. Truly incredible. This is all his power we are feeling." Mew's already large, rounded eyes seemed to get even bigger for a moment. Arceus nodded in reply, but suddenly, she looked forward again in her invisible, miniaturized form and became very focused. "It is time. His coming is upon us, look." The other two legendaries looked toward Delia's bed just as a massive surge of energy shook the delivery room. The upsurge knocked some of the doctors and nurses off of their feet and caused the two smaller legendary Pokémon to tremble a little. Arceus just floated in place, unfazed and possessing a look that belied how anxious she was under the calm facade. After the surge of energy passed, which had rocked the delivery room and shook the hospital, all of the doctors and nurses got back on their feet, and the sight that awaited their eyes left them all dumbfounded. Dilia was laying there on the bed, still writhing in pain, but now her whole body was surrounded by a brightly glowing, electric blue energy field that only kept getting brighter. One of the doctors knew that the baby was about ready to come out. Therefore, summoning up his courage to face something that they were all still telling themselves in denial was a natural occurrence, he ran straight at Dilia and got into a seated position in front of her to deliver the baby. As soon as he got into position, the doctor looked up at her and had to shout over the buzzing of the energy field that was surrounding her. "Mrs. Ketchum." He kept his eyes closed, the light from the energy being so bright that he couldn't look straight at her. "I need you to push when I say to, okay?" Dilia, in her extreme state of pain, could only nod to show that she understood. After the doctor gave her the signal, she began to push, screaming in agony the whole while. This process repeated a few times with the young mother screaming as loud as she could all the while. She began to feel the energy coursing through her body for the very first time during the entire intense ordeal. It felt like fire burning and lightning striking her body all at once, and she gritted her teeth so hard against the painful sensations that her gums bled. At last, once the energy in the room was so intense and so bright that everyone, even the hidden legendaries in the corner of the room, had to close their eyes, the doctor told her to give one last push. As she pushed for the very last time, Dilia gave the most blood-curdling scream yet. Ya hhhhh. And with that last scream, a loud cry was heard throughout the delivery room as the doctor near Delia's legs stood up after a few seconds while cradling something in his arms. "Congratulations, Mrs. Ketchum. It's a boy," the doctor proclaimed just before he quickly snipped the umbilical cord with a pair of medical scissors that one of the nurses hurriedly handed him. At that point, they all just wanted to leave the room. Then, just before handing the infant off to the nurse so that she could take and clean him up, they allowed Delia see her child. Both he and the nurse were still clearly shaken up from the events of the otherworldly birthing they had just witnessed. Delia, though, for her part, could only smile tiredly at the sight of her baby boy before utter exhaustion fell upon her and she slipped into an unconscious sleep. All three legendary Pokémon stared intently at the newly arrived infant with undisguised awe and no small manner of excitement on their faces. Especially Arceus. However, knowing that they would have to wait until later to get a good look at the newborn chosen one, they left for the moment and agreed to come back later on. Soon thereafter, the heavy energy in the room finally lifted and everyone immediately felt lighter as the atmosphere returned to normal. The doctor then turned to the nurse, who took the newborn from his arms and exited the room to go and clean him up. At a later point in time, every doctor and nurse who was involved in the extremely unorthodox, for lack of a better word, delivery, would all agree amongst themselves to never mention what happened in that room ever again. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX Professor Oak and Amelia sitting by her bedside on either side of her. Amelia had taken her daughter home earlier and left her with the same friend that had been watching Gary so that she could be there for Delia's delivery. At that moment, a nurse poked her head inside of the door and, after being cleared for entry, she walked in holding a small bundle wrapped in a blue blanket. Delia looked on anxiously at the baby cuddled in the nurse's arms as she walked closer, and almost on instinct, she put her arms out so that she could receive her child. The nurse smiled at Delia brightly as she handed her the swaddled infant. "Here you go, mommy, he's a very healthy 9.5-pound baby boy." Delia cradled the baby boy in her arms and yet again, on instinct, began rocking him back and forth gently. She smiled warmly and took in the sight that was her son with eyes full of love. He was definitely a healthy-looking baby for sure. In fact, her son looked so healthy that she could swear she saw him glowing. He was also big for an infant, which added to his almost glowing form. He had raven black hair, just like Richard, as well as 3 Z-like marks on both of his small cheeks, also identical to his father. It made Delia smile as she saw this and caused her to think of the man that she loved so much. It also made her wish so desperately that he could have been there to see their son. The professor and Amelia looked on fondly at the sight while at the same time, the nurse turned to leave. Before she made it out of the door, however, she turned around again, realizing she had forgotten to tell the small family something. "Oh, and I just thought you all should know that when I said your little boy was healthy, I meant it. The doctor who examined him said he had never seen a healthier baby in all of his years in medicine. And he is one of the best delivery specialists in the entire Kanto region. That is one special baby you have there indeed." With that, the nurse left the room. Delia looked back at her son, whom was now looking around curiously at everything himself with wide, amber eyes. The same color as Delia's. She then cooed lovingly while looking at him. "He is very special, aren't you, my little one?" Professor Oak took that time to ask. "So, Delia, what is this future Pokémon master's name?" She gave the professor a funny look. "You don't even know if he will like Pokémon, professor, let alone grow up to become a Pokémon trainer." The old man just smiled sagely and shook his head while looking at the currently unnamed little Ketchum, who still had his eyes wandering everywhere, as if trying to take in everything he could see. "Trust me, Delia. With a father like Richard, this little one will grow up with a fiery dose of the traveler's spirit and will most likely adore Pokémon." Delia knew that, most likely, Professor Oak would be right. He almost always was. But she didn't want to think about her son growing up to leave on an adventure of any kind right now. That was something she would take in stride if it ever came to that. Not now though. For now, she just wanted to enjoy him the way he was. Cradled right there in her arms. Sue. Amelia pressed impatiently. What's his name? Delia looked at her son for a few moments before she smiled and then spoke clearly and confidently. His name will be Ashton Richard Ketchum. Amelia and Professor Oak smiled at the choice of name and nodded their heads approvingly. So, Ash Ketchum, huh? The older professor spoke. A great name indeed. It rolls off of the tongue quite nicely. Ooh, I can't take it anymore, Delia. Can I please hold little Ash? Amelia whined desperately. Both Delia and Professor Oak simply shared an amused look at Amelia's impatience before the new mother carefully handed over her son to Amelia. The older woman, quite naturally, promptly began cooing all over him. At least until little Ash started crying to be fed. Once more showing exactly whose son he was by the voraciousness from which he suckled. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX come to tell Professor Oak and Amelia that they had to leave for the night since visiting hours had passed. After they said their goodbyes to Delia and went home for the night, with the promise of coming back tomorrow, the nurse took Ash from Delia so she could get a good night's rest. After assuring her that she would see her son again first thing in the morning, the nurse quietly walked out of the room so Delia could fall asleep. Then, she made her way to the hospital's nursery to deposit the sleeping infant in her arms. Smiling the whole way while thinking about how overprotective new mothers always were. After tucking the newborn Ketchum safely into his little crib in the nursery amongst all the other babies, she smiled down at the little angel while stroking his cheek for a few moments. She didn't understand what it was, but this child just seemed so perfectly at one with everything around him. He had such a warm and peaceful aura around him that she almost didn't want to leave him. The woman earnestly could say that, even after all of her years as a nurse, she had never come across a baby as seemingly special as this one. It was just one of those feelings that told her that this child was going to grow up to become something special indeed. After smiling once more at the infant, the nurse took her leave. It was no more than 10 minutes after she left that something happened. In the corner of the nursery, 3 figures materialized seemingly out of nowhere. When the figures came into view, it showed none other than the goddess of all Pokémon herself, Arceus, who had again shrunken herself down to a smaller size so she could fit into the hospital. She was flanked by 2 smaller legendary Pokémon on both sides of her. On her right side was the ancestor of all Pokémon, Mew. On Arceus' other side was none other than the Melody Pokémon in all of her grace, Melota. As the 3 Pokémon of legends that had not been seen by humans in over 1,000 years floated through the nursery, they stopped at the crib that held none other than the infant himself, Ashton Richard Ketchum. Arceus smiled down warmly at the one she had chosen, whom she knew would help lead the world into a new age of love and understanding. And along the way, she also knew, he would enrich everyone's lives that he met. "Greetings, my dear chosen one." Arceus spoke softly to the little infant so as not to wake him. "I have waited on your arrival for many, many eons now. You, my dear child, are going to be destined for great things in this life. At times, you may feel as though the weight of your destiny is too much or that you are not strong enough to shoulder such burdens, but that will never be the case. In times when you may feel low and cannot seem to find your way, just look to your family and to the many friends, both human and Pokémon, that I know you will someday make. They will be a source of light brighter than any you could ever hope for. And when even that is not enough, remember that I shall always be watching over you, my little chosen one." Her gaze was warm and compassionate. "Anytime you need me, I shall be there for you. For now, though, I leave you with a great gift. This is to help you along the way in your destiny." With those words said, Arceus knelt her down and touched her face gently to the infant's forehead. As soon as the contact was made, a bright light formed around the divine Pokémon and then flowed from Arceus into the sleeping infant. This light encompassed him in the same way that it had for her. When the light itself eventually faded away, the baby still lay sleeping in his crib as though nothing had happened. The only thing different about him now was the small mark that was imprinted upon the infant's right palm. The mark shone a brilliant white and the pattern of it looked like a shining star and a beating heart wrapped around one another inside of a circle. No sooner did the mark appear on the baby's palm and it was suddenly gone. Arceus spoke again once it did. I have bestowed upon you the gift of heart. Speak, little one. With this ability you will be able to communicate with Pokémon through their hearts. Whenever one is agitated, in pain, does not understand your feelings or is enraged, you need only hold up or touch the palm of your hand that now holds the star mark one have given you to a Pokémon's body. Then, you can speak to that Pokémon's heart with your inner feelings and emotions. This is a powerful gift and one that can only be used when the star mark is activated. In addition, when you are not using this ability, the mark on your hand will not be visible. You will not be able to understand Pokéspeech, but as long as you remain connected with the Pokémon that you are trying to reach, you will be able to make it understand your feelings. Very few people have this ability and I am sure that someday, you will meet some of these people on your future travels. The whole time this exchange between Arceus and the newborn infant was happening, Meloda and Mew were transfixed on the baby who was meant to do so much in the world. They didn't know why, but they felt drawn to the child. As though his pure heart was calling out to them and they felt calmed by it. In that moment, they grew attached to the small infant and wanted to do something to help him as well. When Arceus was done bestowing her gift upon Ash, Meloda asked her divine parent a question. Mother, I was wondering something, would it be alright if I also bestowed a gift upon the chosen one? I would like to do the same as well, Mother, Mew chimed in. Arceus was surprised at those requests. She knew that, out of all of her legendary children, Meloda and Mew were two of the most kind and understanding. But, even still, she never would have imagined that both of them would want to give the infant a gift. She was, needless to say, proud of her two children and smiled at both of them. Of course you can, my dears. Meloda and Mew smiled happily and then the former got up close to the crib that held the sleeping baby. She placed her hands on Ash's softly face and then a bright, green and red light poured from Meloda into the infant. When she was done, she spoke. I have given you the gift of soothing words. Anytime there is ever an argument or fight happening between people, including yourself, you will always know the words to say that can help end that disagreement and soothe the pain that was caused from it. As long as the other party is willing. This gift comes from my own ability of being able to calm any situation and quell any battle that may be happening by using my song of soothing, as some people call it. I wish you well, cute little chosen one. Until next time. After Meloda was finished giving her gift and backed away, Mew floated down and rested her forehead upon the brow of the small infant's own. A glowing pink light surrounded both she and the child as she pulsed this same pink energy into him. When she was done, she said to the little Ketchum in her usual chipper voice. I have awoken the psychic powers that lay dormant within you. Because every person has either an affinity to physic or aura abilities, one or the other is always selected if that person is meant to have an ability of some kind. Whichever power is chosen for you at birth is the one that you will be able to use in your life. The other remains dormant within you forever. So you are either a psychic or aura user if you have an ability. No one has ever had both before. Mew floated from side to side as she smiled excitedly. But you can now be both, little one. Over time you will unlock these abilities, and when you do, I am sure that you will find the right teachers to mentor you in their use. I am sure of it. Once her children were done giving their gifts to the infant, who had slept peacefully through it all, Arceus looked at her chosen one a final time. I know that you did not hear or understand anything we have said about your newly received blessings, dear one. But when you are older and you begin to unlock these powers, we will be here to help you understand them. She blinked fondly at the baby once more. We shall see you again in due time, little one. For now, sleep well and grow strong. Farewell, my precious chosen one. I will always be right here when you need me. With that said, the three legends bid each other farewell. Mew disappeared back into the world to seek fun wherever it could be had while Meloda headed back to the Unova region. Arceus watched her children leave through the portal she had made to send them off and then took one last glance at the small baby asleep in his crib. Until next we meet, little one. And with that, Arceus opened a portal for herself that would take her back to the Hall of Origins. Within a few seconds, the mighty Pokémon floated through the portal and closed it behind her, leaving the nursery empty once more. Save of course for the sleeping infants that were getting acquainted with their dream worlds for the first time. In his crib, Ash Ketchum continued to sleep soundly, blissfully unaware of the great destiny laying before his feet that would someday rock the world.